Welcome, weary traveler. You've had a long day of noise and stimulation, of endless decisions and flickering screens. Your mind is full, and it craves a quiet, empty space. Tonight, let us gently dim the lights and turn our attention to something meticulous and profoundly quiet. We will drift back to a very specific, very ordinary day in ancient Rome. Now, we are not here for emperors or gladiators, for epic battles or shocking scandals. No, we are here for the granular, the mundane, the beautifully boring. Imagine a single sun-bleached tile in a vast mosaic. This is our tile. We will examine its texture, its color, its utterly uneventful place in the grand scheme of things. What I was tile. So, find your most comfortable position. Let your breath begin to slow, and allow your dark thoughts to settle like dust in a silent atrium. We are going to talk, in great detail, about the administration of a provincial grain warehouse. The sun, on a day in late summer in the year 137 CE, in the bustling, yet monotonous, port town of Ostia, had ascended to that precise and unwavering zenith where its light ceased to feel illuminating and instead lay across the whitewashed walls, the tessellated courtyards, and the cobbled streets like a heavy woolen blanket suffused with fine, eve dust, a blanket under which the entire world seemed to be drowsing in a state of profound heat-induced inertia, and within this vast, soporific stillness, the daily operations of the Aurea Galbae, the sprawling imperial grain warehouses that formed the vital, unglamorous sinew of Rome's sustenance, proceeded with a cadence so rhythmic and uneventful it could lull a hyperactive squirrel into a trance. A cadence set, not by drums or trumpets, but by the soft, persistent swishing of a broom made of tiety twigs against the compacted earth floor of Granary Shed Number 7. A sound generated by a public slave named Secundus, a man of about 40 years, with a perpetually mild expression and a bald spot that he covered poorly with the remaining strands of his grey-flacked hair, who was currently engaged in the methodical collection of a small, unimpressive pile of wheat chaff that had escaped over the course of the morning from a slightly torn and poorly stitched sack during the quarterly inventory. A task he approached not with resentment or ambition, but with the deep ingrained focus of a man who has found in monotony a kind of peace. His movements, the long even sweeps, the careful angling of the bronze dustpan, the gentle tap against the rim of a secondary barrel designated for annual feed, and miscellaneous organic detritus were so practiced and economical they seemed almost automatic. A piece of human machinery as reliable and unremarkable as the clay water jug that sat cooling in the corner on a stand of woven reed. The granary itself was a long, high-ceilinged structure built of thick brick and mortar, its walls punctuated by a series of small, high windows set with iron grates in a diamond pattern, windows that served less for ventilation and more for the grudging admission of light, which they sliced into thick, solid shafts that cut through the moly, golden air so thick with floating particulate of grain dust and chaff, and the general effluvia of stored agricultural wealth that each beam appeared as a tangible column, a ladder of light upon which countless dust motes performed a silent, endless, and lethargic ballet, drifting upwards on imperceptible thermals only to sink again, never seeming to reach the floor or the ceiling, caught in a perpetual, aimless suspension. The atmosphere held a complex, dry perfume, composed of the sweet hay-like scent of thousands of modii of wheat, the slightly sour, earthy odor of the burlap and hemp sacks that contained it, the faint tannic smell of old, sun-baked wood from the support beams and storage pallets, and underpinning it all, a dry clay-like pungency emanating from the long ranks of identical bulbous amphorae, lined with military precision along the far wall, each one containing refined olive oil, shipped months prior from the province of Baetica. Each one stoppered with cork and sealed with pitch, each one stamped on the handle with a nearly identical maker and #39 mark, a tiny, crude depiction of a dolphin that a junior clerk named Lucius had verified, stamp by identical stamp, against a wax tablet list earlier that very morning, a process that had taken him 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which he had paused only once to take a measured sip of watered-down posca from a leather flask, and to wipe a bead of sweat from his temple with the edge of his simple linen tunic. The little head clerk, a man named Aulus Probus, was now ensconced in his small, shaded office, a cubbyhole created by a wooden partition at the north end of the shed, reviewing the very shipment manifest that Lucius had helped prepare. The figures now, transcribed in Aulus' own neat, compact hand onto a more formal sheet of papyrus, that lay flat on his desk, weighted at the corners by 4 smooth river stones. Aulus was man of 53, his hair uniform iron grey, his face lined not with the dramatic wrinkles of strife, but with the fine, shallow creases of a lifetime of moderate concentration, of squinting at documents in variable light. His stylus, a simple bronze instrument with a slightly blunted point, moved slowly from line to line as he double-checked the calculations for the Alexandrian wheat shipment. The numbers XL received DCL modi, already allocated to the monthly dole for the plebs frumentaria, an estimated loss of 8 modi and 4 sextari due to weevil infestation and general spoilage, blurring slightly before his eyes in the aqueous, shimmering haze of the afternoon heat, a haze that seemed to rise from the very papyrus itself. His primary concern in this moment, a concern that occupied his mind with the total absorption usually reserved for philosophical contemplation, was whether the calculated spoilage rate, which he had meticulously derived as being just under 1/2% of the total shipment, would be accepted by the junior Quaestor's office in Rome without query or demand for a re-audit, a process that would involve days of tedious defensive paperwork and the potential displeasure of the procurator Anani, the chief official of the grain supply, a man Aulus had seen only once at a distance during an inspection a decade ago, and whose frown he still remembered with vague, low-grade anxiety. Outside the granary, beyond the heavy iron-banded oak doors that stood open to admit the listless air, the world of Ostia moved with a similarly subdued tempo. A cart, its wooden bed empty save for a few stray stalks of straw, was being drawn by a single, dun-colored mule whose ears drooped in unison with the driver's head, the man himself, half asleep under a wide-brimmed hat of woven straw, his body swaying gently with the cart's motion. The cart's ungreased axles produced a monotonous rhythmic creak, screok, 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 that echoed dully between the high walls of the warehouse district, a sound so regular it seemed less a noise and more a temporal marker, the heartbeat of the afternoon itself. This creaking syncopated imperfectly with the slow, measured inhalation and exhalation of a large ginger-striped cat that napped atop a stack of empty folded grain sacks in a patch of sun just inside the doorway, its flank rising and falling with a metronomic precision that spoke of absolute, unthinking peace, each breath a tiny event of total insignificance and profound somatic commitment. Nearby, a single iridescent fly, having escaped the notice of the cat, buzzed in a lazy elliptical pattern near a small, neglected spill of grain kernels by the threshold, its flight path describing a figure eight of infinite boredom, before eventually landing on the damp, cool rim of the clay water jug, where it proceeded to clean its front leaks with fastidious, repetitive motions, remaining there, unmoving save for these microscopic adjustments, for a period of time so extended it would defy any reasonable measure of insect attention span. Back within the granary's somnolent depth, Secundus had completed a sweeping of the chaff. He straightened up, a movement accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible pop from his lower back, a sound he no longer noticed, and leaned the broom against the wall in its designated spot, a faint, smooth patch on the brick where the handle rested. Day after day, his next duty, according to the rigid and unchanging schedule posted on Aulus's office wall, was the inspection and resetting of the mousetraps along the western wall, a task that involved 12 simple snare traps baited with hardened crumbs of barley bread. However, this duty was not scheduled to commence until the sun's beam, creeping across the floor, touched a specific fissure in the third paving stone from the northern wall, a natural sundial established by a predecessor long since retired or deceased. Consulting this ancient, unmarked clock, Secundus saw he had approximately a quarter of an hour of custodial limbo. He did not seek out a seat or engage in idle chatter. Instead, he assumed a posture of patient readiness, standing with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, and allowed his gaze to rest upon the geometric pattern of light and shadow cast by the window grates onto the granary floor. The pattern was a grid of intersecting diamonds, sharp-edged where the light was strongest, blurring into soft grey ambiguity at the edges. It was a pattern that shifted with the imperceptible crawl of the celestial sphere, a movement so gradual that to stare at was to doubt motion itself, to feel time stretch into a formless, viscous substance. On the stone windowsill of the farthest window, a small garden snail, its shell a pale, fawn-colored spiral, was engaged in a journey of similarly negligible progress. It extended its shocked eyes with a tentative slowness, its muscular foot propelling it forward by less than a millimeter per minute, leaving behind a faint, silvery trail of mucus that would, Secundus knew from long observation, dry to a nearly invisible, flaky residue by evening, only to be overwritten by a new trail the following day, a palimpsest of pointless itineraries. In the dim, narrow corridor that connected granary, shed 7 to the smaller oil storage annex, the junior clerk Lucius had moved on from his amphora verification to his afternoon task, the copying of updated provincial tax rates as decreed by the imperial fiscus onto a fresh, clean roll of papyrus for archival purposes. He sat on a 3-legged stool before a sloping desk, his posture erect, his tongue protruding slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. His handwriting, developed over 3 years of tutelage under Aulus, was a neat, unremarkable Roman cursive, each letter formed with careful, unhurried strokes, the verticals straight and parallel, the ligatures flowing without flourish. The ink in his pot was a standard, economical blend of lamp soot, gum, Arabic, and water, and it emitted a faint, acrid scent that mingled with the omnipresenter dust. The sound of his reed pen moving across the slightly rough papyrus surface was a soft, steady scratch, a sound as dry as the husks of grain, a companion rhythm to the distant screech of the cart and the now absent swish of Secundus' broom, all of them merging into a single seamless tapestry of quiet, purposeful industry. From a niche in the wall, a cheap, locally made water clock, its inflow vessel nearly empty, dripped with a placid metallic plink, followed by a long silent pause. Then another plink. It marked the passage of minutiae, units of time, too small. And too small, numerous for anyone in the warehouse to care about in that suspended moment. Drop a tiny, aquatic punctuation in the long, run-on sentence of the afternoon. And as this afternoon stretched on, thick and golden and slow, like honey poured from a great height, nothing of any dramatic note transpired. No messenger on a lathered horse clattered into the courtyard, bearing news of a distant barbarian incursion or an emperor's death. No sudden, violent summer storm gathered over the sea to threaten the grain with dampness, sending men scurrying to secure tarpaulins. No heated dispute erupted between the oil merchants from Baetica and the warehouse factors over storage fees. No sacks split their contents in a dramatic cascade. The fly on the fee water jug finished its ablutions and flew away on another lazy circuit. The cat in the soil. The doorway stretched one foreleg, extended its claws in a silent, sharp fan, then settled back into a slightly different, equally profound position of repose. The snail on the windowsill encountered a minute irregularity in the stone, and altered its course by a fraction of a degree. Aulus, in his office, satisfied with his calculations, sanded the papyrus to dry the ink, blowing the fine grains of sand into a small tray. With a soft, sighing breath, he then rolled the document neatly and tied it with a simple linen string, placing it in a woven basket labeled for Questa's review, current month. The acta, phase finale, decisive, and utterly forgettable. The afternoon matured, the angle of the light shifting from a direct overhead assault to a slanted, forgiving embrace. The shadows cast by the granary's columns and stacks of goods lengthened, pooling and cooling the areas they touched. The quality of the heat changed, losing its desiccating edge and acquiring a mellower, more diffused character. The workers, sensing this shift as instinctively as animals, began the slow, unhurried ritual of closing down. Secundus, his sundial Fisher finally reached, made his rounds of the 12 mousetraps. 3 were sprung, empty. 1 contained a small grey field mouse, long deceased and desiccated. He disposed of it without comment, reset the wheel, traps with fresh crumbs from a pouch at his belt, and noted the results. 3 empty drinks, 1 catch. On a wax tablet he carried for the purpose, a tablet whose surface was a chaotic web of previous notations, smoothed and re-smoothed over months of identical report. Lucius finished his line of tax percentages, sanded his work, cleaned his pen by wiping it on a damp cloth, and placed his papyrus roll in a different basket, labeled archival copies, tax code. He then methodically cleaned his desk, aligning his ink pot, penknife, and spare stylus in a precise row before rising and stretching his shoulders. Aulus emerged from his office, a set of iron keys jangling softly on a ring at his belt. Performed a visual sweep of the granary, his eyes passing over the orderly stacks of sacks, the silent ranks of amphorae, the now clean floor, the dormant traps. He nodded. A small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin that signified approval, a daily ritual of silent commendation. He then walked to the massive double doors, Secundus and Lucius falling in step behind him. Together, without a word, they pushed the heavy oak leaves shut, the wood groaning a deep bass protest on its iron hinges. Aulus selected the Lagus key on his ring, inserted it into the heavy bronze lock, and turned it. The mechanism inside well-oiled and precisely fitted, engaged with a solid, resonant clunk that echoed briefly in the suddenly quiet space outside. It was a sound of finality, of security, of a day's duties conclusively discharged. The three men then parted with muted formulaic farewells. Vale Secunda, Aulus said. Vale, Domine, Secundus replied, already turning toward the slaves' quarters. Vale, Luci, Aulus offered to the clerk. Vale, Aule, Lucius responded, nodding. And they walked away, each taking a separate, predictable path along the straight, grid-like road of Ostia, their leather-soled sandals making soft, shuffling sounds against the grit, and sounds that faded quickly into the general evening murmur of the town. The distant calls of children being summoned home, the clatter of a shutter being closed, the scent of cooking fires beginning to waft from hundreds of simple hearths, their minds, unburdened by great thoughts or weighty worries, were already turning toward the unspectacular comforts of a simple evening meal. Perhaps a bowl of pulse, wheat porridge, with a drizzle of the very oil they guarded, a piece of salted fish, some watered, wine, a few olives, inside the locked granary shed number 7. Darkness began to pool in the corners, rising like silent, cool water. The last sliver of sunlight, a brilliant orange blade, sliced through a high western window, illuminated for a few final minutes the still dancing motes of dust, now gilded like tiny, floating coins, before winking out entirely. The heat of the day baked into the clay tiles of the roof and the brick of the walls began its slow process of dissipation, radiating outwards into the cooling night air. The cat, having slipped out moments before the door was closed, was now hunting moths in a different courtyard. The snail had retreated into its shell, sealed with a dried layer of epiphragm, waiting for the dew of morning. The mousetrap sat, baited and ready. In it, the absolute blackness, the papyrus rolls in their baskets, the wax tablets on their shelves, the empty dustpan by the broom, all settled into the profound stillness of inanimate objects, untouched. The granary breathed, not with lungs, but with the slow contraction of materials cooling, the faintest settling of a sack against its neighbor, the almost mythical creak of a timber releasing a fraction of its daytime stress. It was a place of stored potential energy, of calories and commerce held in suspense. Now, wrapped in a cloak of perfect, unrecorded quiet, the day in late summer, in the year 137, was over. Well, it had been a day of routine maintenance and administrative record keeping, a day where the most significant event had been the discovery of a single airline cracked amphora handle during Lucius' morning verification. A discovery that had prompted Aulus to make a brief note on a shard of ostraka for the attention of the local potter, a shard that now sat on the corner of his desk, awaiting tomorrow, a note that would likely be dealt with and then forgotten, filed neither in memory nor in history, lost to the vast benign oblivion of days that simply pass, one after the other, into peaceful, uneventful, and endlessly detailed continuity of life as it was, and is, and ever shall be forever and ever, without climax, without pause. Amen. And so the night began, and with it the gentle, silent decay of the barley crumbs in the mousetraps. A process so slow it was, for all human purposes, a form of stasis in the granary, and the world slept. The night within granary shed number 7 was not a monolithic blanket of black, rather a layered, textured space of subtle gradation. The darkness near the high, grated windows was a soft charcoal gray, faintly illuminated by the diffused glow of a 3/4 moon rising over the Tiber's estuary. a light that was insufficient to cast shadows, but enough to hint at the vast geometrical forms of the storage pillars and the mountainous silhouettes of the grain sacks. Deeper into the shed, where the stacked amphorae formed canyon walls, the darkness thickened into absolute velvet, a complete negation of vision where the air felt cooler and stiller, as if even the dust had gone to sleep. In this profound quiet, sound did not cease, but transformed. The occasional tick of a cooling timber from the roof trusses was a startlingly clear event. Oh, minute scuttling, perhaps a beetle, perhaps the very mouse Secundus traps aimed to catch, echoed with sharp precision across the hard floor. Every half hour or so, the water clock in the corridor, its inflow vessel now completely empty, would release a single final droplet with a resonant plunk that seemed to hang in the air for an impossible duration before being reabsorbed by the silence. Outside, the world of Ostia carried on with its nocturnal rhythms, but these were muffled, distant, and irrelevant to the sealed shed. The occasional shout from a tavern near the river, the bray of a donkey unsettled by a dream, the rhythmic tread of a watchman's boots 2 streets over. All these sounds were filtered and softened by thick brick and heavy oak, reduced to mere murmurs. Like the memory of noise, the primary sensory fact of the granary at night was the smell, which grew richer and more complex in the absence of daylight and human activity. Up, the sweet grain scent deepened, mingling more fully with the oily earthy aroma of the amphorae and the faint, leathery odor of the countless burlap sacks. It was the smell of slow, anaerobic time, of a biomass in patient storage. As the moon traversed its slow arc, its light crept across the floor at a pace even more glacial than the sun's. It reached, around the third watch of the night, the stack of sacks where the ginger cat had napped. It illuminated, with a cold blue-silver clarity, a single, overlooked grain of wheat that had come to rest in a seam of the burlap. The grain, a plump triticum aestivum kernel, was a tiny golden capsule of life in suspense. Its surface, under this lunar scrutiny, was not smooth but finely textured, a landscape of all microscopic ridges and a deep crease where its embryo lay dormant. Nothing happened to it. It did not sprout. No insect found it. The moonbeam simply held it in its pale spotlight for 23 minutes before moving on, leaving it once more in friendly darkness. In the adjacent oil annex, one of the Baetican amphorae, the one with a hairline crack in its handle, noted by Aulus, experienced a phenomenon so minor it bordered on the metaphysical. The crack, due to the nocturnal cooling of the ceramic, contracted by an estimated 5 microns. This contraction caused a particle of the dried pitch seal near the cork to detach, a flake no larger than a grain of sand. It tumbled down the curve of the amphora, making a sound inaudible to any creature on earth, and came to rest on the dusty floor. This was the most significant event to occur in the Vara house between midnight and dawn. Meanwhile, in the modest 6-story insular apartment, where Aulus Probus lived in 3 small rooms on the 4th floor, the head clerk slept a sleep of profound routine. He lay on a simple wooden bed with a rope lattice base atop a wool-stuffed mattress. His breathing was even and slow. He dreamed, not of grandeur or terror, but of paperwork. In the dream, he was verifying a list of numbers that stretched to the horizon on a scroll of papyrus as wide as a road. The numbers were all correct, and the act of verifying Then was not stressful, but deeply, soothingly monotonous. There was no end to the list, and this was not a nightmare, but a comfort. His wife, Tortia, slept beside him, occasionally emitting a soft, sighing snore that was as familiar to him as the sound of his own breath. In a corner of the room, a clay oil lamp, its wick turned down to the merest nip, guttered in a saucer of water, its flame dancing in a tiny hypnotic rhythm dictated by drafts too faint to feel. Secundus the slave slept in the barracks attached to the warehouse complex, a long, low hall filled with straw pallets. He shared the space with 20 other serfs, publici, men who cleaned streets, repaired aqueducts, and maintained public latrines. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and straw and old wool. Secundus slept on his back, one arm flung over his eyes. He did not dream of freedom or of his distant birthplace in Thrace, memories of which had long since faded into a vague tonal nostalgia. Instead, his sleeping mind replayed the sensory experiences of his day. Feel of the broom handle in his palms, the visual pattern of the floor tiles, the satisfying swoosh of collected chaff falling into the barrel. It was a dream of pure procedure, devoid of narrative, a loop of familiar sensation. One of his barrack mates, a man who worked on the dredging barges, muttered something unintelligible about mud. In his sleep, turned over and was silent again. Lucius, the junior clerk, was the youngest of the three, and still possessed a mind that occasionally churned with ambition so vague they were little more than itches. He lived in a rented room in the house of a ship's caulker. Before sleeping, he had spent an hour reviewing a grammar text, hoping to improve his Greek, a skill that might one day elevate him to a position involving correspondence with Alexandria. But sleep had overtaken him, the papyrus roll slipping from his fingers to the floor. He dreamed of the granary, but in his dream he was not copying tax rate. He was instead inscribing the whole great deeds of heroes onto a monumental bronze plaque. However, when he tried to read what he had written, he found it was only endless, perfectly rendered rows of the dolphin stamp from the Vatican Amphora. He felt not frustration, but a peculiar, dream-logic pride in their uniformity. Back in the granary, as the deepest part of the night yielded to the first, faint suggestion of dawn, not a lightening of the sky, but a subtle softening of the quality of the darkness, a shift from ink-black to ash-gray. The resident wildlife began its shift. A small colony of Blatta orientalis, the common cockroach, emerged from a crack in the foundation near the western wall. They were not there for the grain, which was too well protected in sacks, but for the lesser, decaying organic matter, the dust, microscopic molds, the forgotten crumbs. Their antennae waved in the still air as they moved with mechanical, stop-start precision across the floor, their carapaces making a faint, papery rustle that was the dominant sound in the shed for a time. They investigated the base of the water jug, explored the territory around the mousetrap. One cockroach spent 11 minutes circumnavigating the bronze dustpan, and eventually returned to their crack as the grey light grew stronger. Their foray a failure in terms of sustenance, but a success in terms of nocturnal reconnaissance. The sprung mousetraps remained untouched. The first direct sign of the new day was not light or sound, but temperature. A most imperceptible chill, the night's last exhalation, settled onto every surface. This caused the metal of the lock on the great doors to contract minutely, producing a faint, high pitch ting like a single dead note from a lyre string. Then, from far away came the first hesitant crow of a rooster. It was not the clarion call of farm country, but the deep, choked, slightly asthmatic protest of a bird that lived among the warehouses. A sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast silence, but it was a signal. Soon after, the human world began, molecule by molecule, to wake. The grey light at the windows became a pale, watery blue. Individual shapes within the whole granary began to detach themselves from the gloom. The curve of an amphora, the corner of a stack, the handle of Secundus's broom, the dust motes, invisible in the dark, now reappeared, stirred by the faintest pre-dawn thermal, beginning their daily, aimless dance. The snail on the windowsill, sensing the humidity change, slowly, broke its epiphram seal. Alone, in his apartment, Aulus Probus awoke without an alarm. His internal clock as reliable as the water clock in his office. He opened his eyes, blinked at the familiar cracks in the plaster ceiling, and rose. His first action was to pour water from a jug into a basin and splash his face. The water was cool. The ritual was unchanged from the previous day, and the day before that. In the barracks, Secundus was awakened not by a sound, but by the absence of the deep, resonant snoring of the man on the pallet next to him, which had ceased as the man entered a lighter phase of sleep. Secundus sat up, rubbed his face, and pulled on his tunic, the same dun-colored, coarse garment he wore every day. He joined the line of men at the latrine trench, then collected his portion of the morning pulse from the barracks cook, eating it standing up without haste or relish, merely fueling the body for the day's labor. Lucius was the last awake, startled from his dream of dolphin stamps by the sound of the sound. His landlord, the caulker, banging a mallet in the courtyard below, beginning the day's work on a damaged hull. Lucius groaned softly, retrieved his grammar text from the floor, and began his own morning routine, which included a slightly more careful arrangement of his hair than Aulus or Secundus would bother with. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Aulus, keyring in hand, arrived at the heavy oak doors of granary, shed number 7. Secundus was already there, waiting silently. Lucius arrived a moment later, smoothing his tunic. The three men exchanged the same minimal greetings as the evening before. Salve Secunda, salve Domine, salve Luci, salve Aula. Aulus inserted the large key, turned it with that satisfying, heavy clunk, and together they pushed the doors inward. The fresh, cool morning air, smelling of the sea and damp stone, rushed into the granary, mingling with and momentarily overpowering the stored scent of grey and oil. The first blade of sunlight, sharp and horizontal, stabbed through the eastern window, laying a brilliant orange gold rectangle on the floor, exactly where Secundus had swept the chaff the day before. The new day in the granary was, in every meaningful respect, identical to the last, though same tasks awaited, the same sacks sat in the same stacks, the same amphorae stood in the same rows, the same dust motes, perhaps the very same ones, drifted in the newly illuminated air. Secundus picked up his broom, not because it needed to be used immediately, but because it was the first tool of his day, an extension of his purpose. He stood holding it, waiting for Aulus' first instruction. Aulus walked to his office, his eyes doing their morning visual sweep, noting with approval that nothing was disturbed. He saw the ostraka shard with the note about the cracked amphora handle. Today, he would have to send for the potter, give the most pressing item on his agenda. Lucius went to his corridor desk, checked his ink, tested his pen on a scrap, and prepared for whatever copying task Aulus would assign. The fly from yesterday, or its morphological twin, buzzed in through the open door and began to investigate the now empty water jug. The cycle was ready to begin anew. A wheel turning on an axle of ag. Routine so well greased it was silent, frictionless, and eternal. The granary awaited the first official action, which would be Ola's review of the nightly mousetrap report from Secundus, a report that would almost certainly detail empty springs and a single, desiccated catch, a report that would be heard, acknowledged with a nod, and then forgotten as the vast, quiet, uneventful machinery of the day, and the next, and the next, after that, clicked into its perpetual, soothing, and profoundly boring motion. The morning's first official action, as immutable as the course of the stars, was indeed presentation of Secundus's mousetrap report. The slave stood at the threshold of Aulus' small office, his wax tablet held in both hands like a votive offering. Aulus, having settled onto his stool and arranged a blank sheet of papyrus for the day's ledger, looked up. He did not extend his hand for the tablet. The ritual was oral. Report, Aulus said, his voice a dry, even rasp, still clearing the phlegm of sleep. Domine, Secundus began, his eyes fixed on a point just above Aulus' left shoulder. 12 traps, inspected at first light. 9 were unsprung. 2 were sprung, empty. 1 contained a catch. A field mouse, deceased. He paused, the prescribed pause for any follow-up question. There was none. The traps have been reset with fresh bait. Aulus gave the single, slight nod. The information was entered into the ledger not as narrative, but as numerals under the column, headed pestis controlum, 9th intacta, vacua elusa, I captus mortuus. He then made a small mark in the margin, a tick that indicated the task had been completed and verified. This mark would be transferred monthly to a master summary, a document consulted by no one but filed in a chest in the curator's archives in Rome, where it would molder peacefully for decades. The cracked handle on amphora D7, Aulus said, moving on without a pause, picking up the shard of ostraka. Lucius will take this note to Felix the potter and the vicus, Nahum, after the morning inventory. Ensure he understands it as a minor repair, not a replacement. We will not be charged for a replacement. Yes, Domine, Lucius said from the doorway, where he had been waiting. He stepped forward, took the pottery shard, and glanced at the notation. Des even fissura in ansa toti nansa reparare non mutare. He knew the way to the potter's quarter, a 10-minute walk through streets, now coming to life with the delivery of water, the opening of water shutters, the first carts of vegetables rumbling towards the forum. Secundus, Aulus continued, his stylus already moving to the next item on his mental list. Malleus, the spillage near the northwest pillar from the Alexandrian sacks, a full sweep and collection. Then, inspect the seams of the surrounding sacks for further weakness. Report any needing restitching. Then, yes, Domine, Secundus murmured, and turned his sandals whispering on the floor as he went to fetch his broom and a needle and thread of hemp cord from his small toolbox. Thus, the machinery of the day engaged its first gear. Lucius returned to his desk too, prepare for the morning inventory, which involved counting a specific randomly selected stack of grain sacks to verify the head count against the manifest. A task of Oz, sublime tedium that required him to make tally marks in groups of 5 on a wax tablet. A process where the greatest danger was losing one's place in a monotonous rhythm. Gacundus began his sweeping at the designated pillar. His movements a study in economy. The spill was perhaps 2 handfuls of grain, but he treated it with the reverence of a priest cleansing a temple floor, ensuring every last golden kernel was returned to the sack from which it had escaped, his needle then flashing in a patch of sun as he reinforced the torn seam with a series of small, tight, identical stitches. Outside, Ostia achieved its morning pitch. The sound was not a cacophony, but a layered symphony of mundane industry. From the bakeries came the deep, hollow thump of loaves being slid into oven. From the forge near the river, the irregular clangale, tap-tap of a smith working on a rivet, the cries of fishmongers setting up their stalls on. Docks were thin and reedy, carried on a breeze that still held the night's chill. School of children, shepherded by a bored pedagogue, chanted multiplication tables in unison as they passed the granary, their voices fading as they turned a corner. These sounds formed the auditory backdrop, noticed and then forgotten by the men inside, as integral to the atmosphere as the dust. The morning light strengthened, the shafts from the high windows widening and brightening from orange gold to a clear, pale yellow patch of sunlight that had held the single grain of wheat now climbed the wall, illuminating instead a section of the brickwork where the mortar had crumbled slightly, revealing the redder clay of the brick beneath. A tiny, delicate spider, no larger than a lentil, had spun a web in this crevice. During the night, the web was a masterpiece of geometric precision, dewed with light. Moisture that caught the light in 1,000 brilliant pinpoints. But the spider sat motionless at its center, waiting for a midge that would never come into the granary's dry interior. Its wait would be as long and uneventful as Secunda sleeping. Lucius, having completed his tally of the grain sacks, 117, exactly matching the manifest, a fact that brought him neither joy nor disappointment. Only a sense of correct alignment was now dispatched to the potter's quarter with the ostraka shard. His walk was a study in predictable urban scenery. He passed the same bakery he passed every day, smelling the same sourdough. He nodded to the same old woman who sold chickpeas from a pot at the same street corner. He stepped aside for the same team of oxen, dragging a load of marble blocks towards the temple construction site, their driver issuing the same low, guttural command. The Vicus Viglinarum was a street of open-fronted workshops, the air thick with the smell of wet clay and wood smoke from the kilns. He found Felix, a potter with forearms like knotted ropes and a permanent dusting of grey clay in his beard, turning a bowl on a kick wheel, his foot pumping rhythmically. Lucius waited until the wheel slowed. Felix, from the Horia Galbai, a repair. He held out the shard. Felix took it, squinted at the notation, and grunted. Cracked handle. D7. Weiterkicken. Oilja. Minor. He tossed the shard onto a shelf, cluttered with similar fragments, broken bouts, and discarded textiles. I'll send my boy before noon. I'll fill it with slurry and fire it in the next glaze batch. It'll hold. Now, Marie, pause. Lucius asked, rehearse. 2 S's. For the heat and the slurry, Felix said, already turning back to his wheel, his foot beginning its pump again. The negotiation was non-existent. It was the standard rate for such a fix. Lucius nodded, and before noon, Dart Mayin. He turned and walked back, the transaction complete. It would be logged upon his return, reparatio amphorae, to assess. The potter's boy would come, perform the repair with a skill born of 1,000 repetitions, and leave. The amphora would remain in its place, its value and function unimpaired, its minor flaw rendered structurally irrelevant. The event would merit no further thought. Back at the granary, the late morning settled into a deep, warm torpor. The inventory complete, the sweeping done, the minor repair arranged, a lull descended. This was the time for maintenance of tools and record. The Kunda sat on a low stool near the doors, sharpening the blade of a small sickle used for cutting twine, drawing it slowly, methodically, over a whetstone, with a sound like a slow, dry whisper. Check, click, mud, back, muddy. Each stroke was identical in pressure and length. Aulus reviewed the previous month's expenditure scroll, comparing the cost of replacement sacks from the Weavers' Guild against the quarterly budget, finding a discrepancy of 3 sestati in the Guild's favor, a sum so small it was beneath official contestation, but which he noted in a marginal comment for future reference, a comment that would never be referenced. Lucius, having returned, was now tasked with preparing fresh wax tablets for the following week, melting down the old smooth wax over a tiny brazier and pouring Ido carefully into the wooden frames, a process requiring patience and a steady hand to avoid bubbles. The smell of melting beeswax, sweet and faintly honeyed, mingled with the other granary scents for a short while. The sun climbed to its zenith. The heat returned, thicker now, pooling under the granary's high roof. The shafts of light became blindingly bright, forcing the men to avert their eyes from certain angles. The fly, having found nothing of interest, departed. The cat from yesterday did not return. It was likely dozing in a cooler spot near the fish market. The snail on the windowsill had retreated once more from the advancing sun. Although the appointed hour, the potter's boy arrived, a skinny youth of about 14, carrying in a small clay pot of grey slurry and a leather pouch of tools. He was escorted by Secundus to Amphora 7. Without a word, the boy mixed a bit of water into his slurry too. The correct consistency, worked it into the hairline crack with a thin metal pick, smoothed the surface with a damp rag, and affixed a small identifying tag to the handle with a bit of string. But he'll be fired tonight. Tag comes off tomorrow, he muttered, then left, his task complete in under 5 minutes. Secundus noted the completion in his mental log. The noon break was a silent affair. Each man ate his brought meal in his accustomed spot. Aulus at his desk, Secundus on his stool by the door, Lucius on the steps outside, in a thin strip of shade. The food was unvaried: bread, cheese, a few olives, perhaps a big water from the jug. No wine during the workday. They chewed slowly, not from home, savoring, but from habit. Their eyes were vacant, resting on nothing in particular. The granary too seemed to pause, the very dusts settling slightly in the heavy air. This was the hinge of the day, the still point. Soon, the sun would begin its long, slow western decline, and the afternoon's duties. A final check of the salt stores in the adjacent shed, the updating of the daily transaction log, the preparation of the weekly report summary for Alice to compile, would commence. But for now, there was only the act of mastication, the warmth of the bread, the salty tang of the cheese, the drone of a solitary bee trapped high in a window, buzzing against the iron grate in a futile pacific protest. The bee's struggle was a tiny drama of no consequence, a background hum that would continue intermittently until the creature exhausted itself or found the one loose bar through which it had entered. Its fate was of no more note than the number of stitches Secundus had put in the torn sack, or the exact shade of grey of Felix the Potter's slurry. It was simply part of the day's texture, a thread in the vast, dull, beautifully woven tapestry of a Tuesday in late summer. In the year of the consulship of Caesar Lucius, Aelius Aurelius, Commodus, and Gaius Bruttius Praesens, in the port of Ostia, in the warehouse of the emperor, where the grain waited, the oil rested, and time passed in a quiet, unbroken stream, carrying all things, great and small, towards the same silent, bureaucratic sea. The afternoons, duties unfolded with the serene predictability of a well-rehearsed religious rite, each action its own silent prayer to the gods of routine. Following the noon respite, Aulus Probus initiated the afternoon phase by consulting his master's schedule, a diptych of wax tablets that governed their lives with benevolent tyranny. His stylus tapped lightly against the notation for post-meridium. Secundus, he intoned, his voice now fully cleared of sleep's residue and possessing its customary dry authority. The salt stores in Annex B require a moisture inspection. The procurator's last edict emphasized vigilance following the spring rains. You will examine the northwest corner where the roof was reported to have a minor leak. Use the iron probe. Record any clumping or dampness beyond 2 finger widths depth. Yes, Domine, Secundus responded, rising from his stool. He collected the designated tool from a rack on the wall, a slender iron rod about 2 feet in length, with a sharp point and graduated markings etched into its surface. The salt annex was a smaller, adjoining chamber, less spacious than the main granary, but equally orderly, its floor covered in a shallow sea of coarse grey-white salt, piled into long, flat-topped mounds, like miniature, sterile mountain ranges. This salt was not for the plebeian dole, but for the preservation of meats and fish destined for the military and certain civic institutions, and its quality, specifically its dryness, was a matter of recorded importance. Meanwhile, Aulus turned his attention to Lucius. The daily transaction log for the Horia complex is due for compilation. You will collect the tallies from sheds 5, 6, and 8 regarding outgoing allocations to the Bakers' Guild. Cross-reference them against the chits issued by the questor's office yesterday. Any discrepancy, even of a single modius, is to be brought to me immediately. Employ the abacus for the sums. I will verify them independently. Lucius accepted the assignment with a nod, his mind already sorting through the procedures. The walk to the neighboring sheds, the polite but formulaic exchanges with all the other clerks, men he knew by face and function, but not by any personal detail, careful collection of their wax tablets, the return to his desk, the rhythmic clicking of the abacus beads, a sound like distant wooden rainfall. It was work that demanded absolute focus to achieve a result of perfect nullity. The happy circumstance of the numbers matching, leaving no trace of action in the world but a mark of confirmation. Secundus entered the salt annex, and the world changed. The light here was dimmer, the air cooler and sharper, carrying a metallic, tangy scent that prickled in the nostrils. The silence was even more profound, a dense, mineral quiet broken only by the soft crunch of his sandals on the few stray crystals scattered near the door. He approached the northwest corner, where a patch of the brick wall showed a darker water stain. View from a long repaired tile in the roof above. Kneeling, he inserted the iron probe into the salt mound at the base of the wall. The resistance was uniform, a dry, granular grit. He pushed it to the 2-finger depth mark, withdrew it, and examined the tip. It was unmarred by dampness, the salt falling from it in a dry stream. He moved a hand, breadth to the left, and repeated the process, and again, and again. He probed 12 points in a precise grid pattern across the suspect area. Each withdrawal produced the same result. Dry, free-flowing salt. The repaired roof had held. The procurator's concern, while prudent, was unfounded for this quarter. But Secundus noted this on his wax. Tablet inspi, salis ang, esepte, oxee, twaptomta examinata, nullum humorum inveni, per, then, though not required, smooth the salt where he had probed, restoring the pristina, undulating surface of the mound with the side of his hand, an act of aesthetic completion that pleased him in a way he could not have articulated. As Secundus performed his methodical prodding, Lucius embarked on his errand. Jed, 5 was dedicated to legumes, lentils, beans, and chickpeas, stored in great bins. The air there was dustier, provoking a faint tickle in his throat. The clerk, an older man, named Marcus with a perpetual squint, handed over his tablet without looking up from a letter. Baker's Guild, 100 modi lentils, 50 modi chickpeas, shit number, quadragesimus tertius, he recited by rote. Head 6, held millet and barley, a heavier, earthier smell. The clerk here was younger, eager, and double-checked his own figures before passing them to Lucius with a superfluous smile. William, legitimately, a superfluous smile. Shade 8, the sister granary. To 7, held more wheat. Its clerk, a dour Illyrian named Decius, merely grunted and audibly shoved his tablet across the table. Lucius collected them all, the wooden frames warm, from their respective offices, and returned to his corridor desk. Back in the main granary, Hollis was engaged in his own solitary ritual. The weekly review of the fire prevention measures. This involved walking a slow circuit of the entire perimeter, checking the placement and fill level of the large ceramic dolia, filled with water and sand that stood sentinel at regular intervals. He tested the integrity of the leather buckets hanging beside them, ensuring the seams were sound and the handles firmly attached. He looked up at the ceilings, scanning for cobwebs that could serve as tinder, though Secundus' sweeping was impeccably thorough. This walk was a meditation on catastrophe averted, a reinforcing of the walls against chaos. He found and nothing amiss. At each station, he made a tiny mark on a mental checklist, a process that consumed 23 minutes of the afternoon. The potter's boy returned, as promised before noon, but it was now well into the afternoon. He entered, nodded silently to Secundus, who had returned from the salt annex, and went to Amphora at 7. The small identifying tag was still in place. With a pair of iron pincers, he carefully snapped off the tag, examined the repaired handle. The slurry, now fired, was a slightly different, glossier grey than the original ceramic, gave a grunt of satisfaction, and departed. The repair was now part of the object's history, a tiny scar that strengthened rather than weakened it. Secundus noted the completion of the repair in his log. Lucius, meanwhile, had begun his calculation. The abacus, a simple wooden frame, with rows of beads, sat before him. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, sliding beads up and down the rods with a soft clack, clack, clack. He transferred figures from the collected tablets, his lips moving slightly as he sub-vocalized the sums. Centum etam, viginti, ade quadraginta quinque, Sama estentum sexaginta quinc. The This process was hypnotic, a numerical liturgy. The afternoon sun, now slanting, cast a long, one parallelogram of light across his desk, illuminating the dancing dust stirred by his movement. He completed the totals for shed 5, then 6, then 8. He unrolled the scroll containing the official chits from the questor's office, parchment slips, stamped with seals and signed by an undersecretary. He compared the figures. Lentils, Wendio, matched Totoy, chickpeas, matched away, Milane, matchahu, Matodovanetuga, barley, matched Tondu, wheat from shed 8. Discrepancy. The quaestor's chit, authorized 1000 modi. Dacius tablet, recorded 1001. Modi, allocated. Lucius frowned. A single modius. It was nothing. A rounding error. A sack counted twice, in a moment of distraction. Yet procedure was procedure. He rose and carried the tablets and the scroll to Ola's office. Domine, he said, interrupting Aulus, who was now reviewing Secundus' salt report. A discrepancy. Yet a hate. 1 modius of modi, wheat, oiled, lithium and a what had happened. Aulus took the tablets, his eyes scanning the figures. He did not sigh or show irritation. This was part of the weave of the day, a snag to be smoothed. Dacius is prone to double counting the sack by the door, Aulus said, his voice devoid of blame. Return to JV. Recount the outgoing stack with him. It will be 1000. Correct his tabletonto. Leave it out so at the end. Have him initial a correction. Leaving. Yes, Domine. Lucius made the journey back to shed 8. Dacius, when confronted with the discrepancy, scowled but assented. Together, they counted the clearly designated stack of sacks earmarked for the Baker's Guild. Lucius counted aloud, Decius grunting in agreement at each 10th sack. The total was, as Aulus predicted, exactly dotal. Dacius, with ill grace, took his stylus, smoothed the wax of his tablet, and incised the correct figure. He then made his mark, a simple dot, next to it. The correction took 15 minutes. The lost modius had never existed. The universe was returned to. The sun continued its decline. The shafts of light in granary 7 grew longer, richer, more golden, and began to climb the eastern wall. The spider, in the brick crevice, having caught no prey, began cautiously to consume its own web, a process of meticulous reclamation that would take until dusk. Secundus, his duties complete, began the final sweeping, not because the floor was dirty, but because the final sweeping was decreed by the schedule. The broom's swish was the day's lullaby. Aulus started to compile the weekly summary report, a document that synthesized the salt inspections, the grain disbursements, the repairs, the pest control, into a single succinct paragraph of bureaucratic Latin that would convey in essence that nothing of significance had occurred. He wrote slowly, choosing each word for its neutrality, and as the final act, Lucius prepared the outgoing correspondence. The weekly report, corrected tally from shed 8, and a request for a new supply of sealing wax. Their current stick being diminished to a nub, he placed them in a leather satchel destined for the courier who would take them to Rome on the following day. He sealed the satchel with a blob of the very wax in question, impressing the stamp of the Horia Galbi, sheaf of wheat, and an amphora, into its warm surface. The impression was clean, and deep cut sound. The ritual of closure began anew. Secundus returned the broom and the probe to their racks. And he checked the mousetraps once more, finding them all untouched since the morning reset. Lucius cleaned his desk, capping the ink pot, aligning his styluses. Aulus handed the weekly report, blew the dust away, rolled it, and tied it. He placed it in the foul basket. The three men converged at the great doors as the sun painted the western sky in tones of rose and ochre. The world outside was softening into evening. The cart traffic had ceased. The sounds were now of closing shutters and evening greetings. The same key, the same heavy clunk, the same groaning of the oak doors swinging. The same muted farewells. Vale Secunda, Vale Domina, Vale Luci, Vale Auto de Dados, Auto Atapanal, They walked their separate paths. In the granary, the darkness gathered, identical to the previous night, yet entirely new. The repaired amphora handle, now cooled and hardened, was indistinguishable in function from its neighbors. The single probe spot in the salt mound had settled back into perfect anonymity. The corrected number on Dacius' wax tablet would be smoothed away forever in the next weekly cycle. They'll know to you. No, spider had consumed half its web. The moon, one night fuller, would rise along a nearly identical path, casting its light upon a floor swept to the same degree of cleanliness, upon sacks and jars that had imperceptibly settled a micron deeper into their foundations under the gentle, unrelenting pressure of gravity and time. Another day, in the year of the consulship of Caesar, Lucius Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, and Gaius Bruttius presence had passed in the port of Ostia, within the warehouse of the emperor, and the great, silent engine of administration had turned another flawless, frictionless rotation, producing nothing but the quiet assurance of continuity, a continuity as deep and endless and uneventful as the slow, dry, untroubled sleep of the empire itself. The night that followed was a brother to the one before, yet with its own singular, inconsequential signature. The phase of the moon had advanced, rendering its light slightly brighter, a more silvered pewter than the soft charcoal of the previous evening. This extra luminescence allowed the geometric patterns of the window grates to cast a slightly sharper, more defined grid upon the granary floor. One of these pale lines of light fell directly across the eyes of the ginger cat, which had, on a whim, returned to its favored napping stack just before the doors were locked, and was now trapped inside. The light did not disturb the cat's slumber. Instead, it caused the feline to dream of sun-bound stones. Its paws twitched slightly in a silent miniature chase of nothing at all. The temperature gradient was different in height as well. A faint, almost undetectable, breeze from the northwest, having traveled over cooler inland hills, found its way through the high windows, creating a persistent draft. This draft caused a slight stirring in the otherwise stagnant air. It was not enough to disturb the dust on the floor, but it set the delicate, half-consumed web of the brick crevice spider to a gentle, persistent trembling. The spider, sensitive to the slightest vibration, misinterpreted this constant tremor as the struggle of a colossal, ensnared prey. It remained motionless at the center of its remaining web for over an hour, in a state of tense, futile anticipation, before finally accepting the lack of nutritional reward and resuming its meticulous consumption of the silk. In the salt annex, the minor atmospheric change had a more measurable effect. The dry, metallic air was subtly invaded by a hint of dampness from the breeze. This moisture did not reach the salt mounds. The repaired roof saw to that, but it caused a single, solitary crystal of salt, perched at the very peak of the northwestern mound. Secundus had probed to undergo a process known as deliquescence. Over the course of 6 hours, this crystal absorbed a microscopic amount of water from the air, causing its sharp, cubic structure to soften ever so slightly at the edges, becoming a tiny, perfect sphere of brine for a brief moment, before the ambient dryness of the annex reclaimed it, leaving the crystal recrystallized into a marginally more rounded, less perfect cube. So, change was invisible to the human eye, and of zero practical consequence to the salt's preservative quality. It was a molecular event of profound unimportance. Outside, the world carried on. In a tavern near the river, a dice game concluded with a minor, quickly settled dispute over a bet of 3 asses. A watchman on the eastern wall thought he saw a shadow move near the old temple of Vulcan and investigated, finding only a dog foraging among discarded olive pits. In Rome, 80 miles away, the junior quaestor, whose office would receive all this weekly report, dined on stuffed dormice and discussed poetry with a client. The administrative machinery of the grain supply the furthest thing from his mind. Courier who would carry the satchel slept soundly in it, his rented bunk, his leather bag already packed with other scrolls and tablets from Ostias magistrates, a mundane constellation of officialdom. As the night reached its nadir, a predictable event occurred within the granary. The little mouse, whose deceased cousin had been disposed of by Secundus, perhaps a sibling, perhaps an unrelated rodent, driven by the same instinctual map, emerged from its hide in a gap where the foundation met the wall. It was cautious, its whiskers twitching, its noses sampling the air for the scent of predator or pine resin from the trap. It avoided the baited snares with an inherited or learned wisdom. Its mission was not for the grain in the stout sacks, but for the smaller, forgotten treasures. It scurried along the edge of the wall, a grey blur in the moonlight, and discovered the tiny, recrystallized salt sphere that had reformed on the floor of the annex, having fallen from the mound during Secundus' probing. Near the mouse licked it once, found the taste violently disagreeable, and sneezed a minute, inaudible sneeze. It then ventured into the main shed and found, by impeccable rodent luck, the single grain of wheat that had been spotlighted by the moon the previous night, which had finally been dislodged from its burlap seam by the faint, persistent draft. This was a prize. The mouse seized it in its jaws and, with a flick of its tail, vanished back into the foundation crack, its entire nocturnal expedition a success quantified in one single hard-won kernel. The granary was thus slightly poorer by 1 grain of wheat, a loss that would never be recorded in any ledger, for it existed beneath the lowest threshold of Roman accounting. Dawn's approach was heralded not by a rooster, but by a change in the song of a particular sparrow that nested under the eaves of shed 5. Its first chirps were sleepy, experimental cracks in the silence. Then, as the sky lightened from black to deep indigo, it launched into its full, repetitive anthem. This awakened the cat, who stretched, yawned, revealing a tiny pink tongue, and began to methodically wash its left front paw, preparing for the day and the hopeful opening of the doors. Within the barracks, Secundus awoke at the same moment he always did, a moment before the barracks overseer clapped his hands to signal the rising. He lay still for those few heartbeats, listening to the familiar pre-dawn symphony of snores, coughs, and rustling straw. In his apartment, Aulus' eyes opened. He did not move immediately, but contemplated the faint, growing light around the edges of his shuttered window, mentally reviewing the day's known duties. the expected arrival of the sampling agent from the Shippers Guild to test the quality of the Alexandrian wheat, a task that would involve much standing around and observing. Lucius, in his rented room, was roused by the caulker's mallet beginning even earlier than usual. A rapid tap 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 signified urgent work on a bilge leak. He groaned, a little louder than the day before. A tiny rebellion against the monotony that was itself part of the routine. The morning rituals were performed with the same ingrained precision. Faces were splashed, tunics donned, simple breakfasts consumed. The three men converged upon the great oak doors of Shed 7 as the first true gold of sunrise gilded the highest tiles of the roof. The greetings were exchanged in the same flat, collegial tone. Salve to, salve to. The key turned, the clunk echoed, the door swung inward. The first sight that greeted them was the cat, sitting primly just inside, blinking slowly at them as if annoyed by their tardiness. It stalked out between their legs without a sound, saking its breakfast among the dockside rats. The morning light flooded in, revealing a granary that was, to the untrained eye, identical to the one they had left. But to them, small differences were apparent. Secundus' eyes immediately went to the spot by the northwest pillar. The floor was clean, his stitches holding. Aldous' gaze swept the amphora. The tag was gone from 7. The repair a smooth grey scar. Lucius glanced at his desk. Everything was as he left it. Secundus presented his mousetrap report. 12 traps, 11 unsprung. Und die Levos antwortete until the 11 unsprung. One sprung, empty, no catch. Les Italians. Paulus nodded. The lack of a catch was good. It suggested the population was dwindling, or growing wiser. He recorded it. Veci intacta, ivacua lusa, nihil captum. The morning's first real task was announced. The sampling agent from the Naviculari. Alexandrini Guild is expected after the 3rd hour, Aulus said, consulting his schedule. Secundus, you will prepare the sampling tool and a clean basket. Select 3 sacks from the middle of the Alexandria stack, not from the top or side. Lucius, you will be present to record the agent's seal and his assessment. I will observe. This was a break in the routine, but a break governed by strict protocol. The quality of the grain was paramount, and the Shippers Guild had the right to verify that the product delivered matched the grade specified in the contract. It was a moment of minor, formal tension. The next 2 hours were spent in preparatory calm. Secundus retrieved the sampling tool, a long, hollow bronze tube with a sharp corkscrew tip that could be driven into a sack and withdrawn with a core sample of grain. He polished it with a rag until it shone. He then selected a small new wicker basket and lined it with a piece of clean linen. Lucius prepared a special wax tablet, smoothing the surface perfectly, ready to record the agent's official stamp and his one-word verdict. Probatus, approved, or improbatus, rejected. Rejections were rare, cataclysmic events that triggered flurries of paperwork and official inquiries. They had not had one in over 4 years. Just after the 3rd hour, measured by the shadow on the floor, falling across a specific crack, the agent arrived. He was a Greek named Xenophon, a man with a carefully trimmed beard and the tired eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime judging commodities. But he carried a satchel containing his seals and a small set of brass scales. Introductions were minimal. But he moved to the designated stack of Alexandrian wheat, under the watchful eyes of Aulus and Xenophon. Secundus performed the sampling with the grace of ritual. He positioned the corkscrew tip against the rough burlap of the First selected sack, placed his palm on the tool's blunt end, and leaned his weight into it with a firm twisting motion. Well, there was a sound of tearing fabric, then a softer crunch as the tip penetrated the grain. He withdrew the tool, its hollow core now filled with a cylindrical sample. He tapped it out onto the linen in the basket. The grain spilled out, plump, golden, uniform. He repeated the process twice more from 2 other dark sacks. 3 neat piles of grain sat on the linen. Xenophon stepped forward. He did not touch the grain immediately. First, he examined it visually, looking for discoloration, excessive broken kernels, or signs of weevil frat. He then took a handful from each pile, brought it to his nose, and inhaled deeply, checking for the musty scent of damp or fermentation. Satisfied, he took a few kernels and placed them in his mouth, chewing slowly, evaluating the hardness and flavor. Finally, he used his tiny scales to verify that a measured volume of the grain weighed within the accepted range for its grade. The entire process took about 15 minutes, conducted in a silence broken only by the rustle of grain and the soft clink of brass. Weights. He straightened up, wiped his hands on a cloth from his satchel, and looked at Aulus. Probatus, he said, his voice neutral. Aulus gave a slight bow of acknowledgement. Lucius, with a flourish that was the closest thing to excitement his job offered, inscribed the word probatus in large, clear letters on his tablet. Xenophon then produced a cylindrical seal from his satchel, pressed it into a small lump of clay Lucius provided, and affixed the clay lump to the corner of the tablet, imprinting it with the guild symbol, a ship's prow, and an ear of wheat. The transaction was complete. The grain was officially, formally, boringly acceptable. Xenophon packed his scales, nodded once, and departed, his footsteps fading down the corridor. The rest of the day was an anticlimax, a return to the deeper rhythms. The sampled grain, its purpose served, was not wasted. Secundus carefully poured it from the linen back into the torn sacks, the small holes from the sampler now adding to the collection of minor imperfections that covered each sack like scars of honor. He would stitch these, closed later. Lucius carefully set the sealed tablet aside to dry. It would be stored with the shipment's documentation, a permanent record of approval no one would likely ever consult unless something went catastrophically wrong, which it would not. The afternoon was spent on ledger consolidation. Aulus dictated figures from the week's tablets to Lucius, who transferred them to a master papyrus roll that summarized the entire complex holdings and disbursements. It was a symphony of numbers, a drone of quantities and measures. Wheat, Alexandrian, hold at 14,220 mo detail, less allocation to Baker's Guild of 1,000 moti. Hold 13,220. Lucius' pen scratched faithfully. Barley, Egyptian, hold at 6,100. Salt, Iberian, hold at 900 modi. Oil, Behican, hold at 1,140 amphorae, less one for official use by the Quaestor staff. Net hold 500 MTU, and 39. And so it went, through lentils, chickpeas, millet, garum, and even the small store of boiled grain reserved for animal feed. The numbers filled the papyrus, a testament to immense static wealth. As Lucius wrote, Secundus took inventory of their cleaning supplies, counting brooms, tallying empty sacks, measuring the remaining hemp twine on its spool. He noted they had 4 brooms in serviceable condition, one needing tying, 17 empty sacks patched and ready for reuse, and an estimated 200 feet of twine. Well, he reported this to Olus, who noted it on a separate inventory of instrumenta. Parallel, as the sun began its final descent, casting the long sentimental shadows of early evening, a single, unexpected event occurred, though its significance was purely personal. Lucius, while sanding the completed master ledger, happened to look up and out the open door. He saw a young woman, perhaps a daughter of one of the fishmongers, walking past with a basket of mending on her head. She had a certain grace in her step, and a wisp of dark hair had escaped her kerchief. She glanced towards the granary, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before she looked away and turned down an alley. It was nothing. Oh, it was less than nothing. She was gone. But for Lucius, in that moment, the entire granary, the dust, the numbers, the dry smells seemed to recede, replaced by a vivid, inexplicable pang of something akin to longing, or perhaps merely the recognition of a world outside the grid of sacks and ledges. The feeling was as acute as it was brief. He blinked, looked back down at the papyrus, and continued sanding. The incident was not recorded, not mentioned, but it existed, a tiny emotional mouse, stealing a single psychic grain from the vast storehouse of his routine. It left him faintly unsettled for the remainder of the hour, a dissonant note in the day's harmony that only he could hear. The closing ritual proceeded unchanged. Tools were put away, the doors were shut and locked with the familiar clunk. The farewells were exchanged. The three men departed. Departed. The granary was left to another night, where the moon would trace a slightly different path. The dust would settle in a slightly different pattern, and the infinitesimally diminished store of wheat, now 1 kernel less due to the mouse theft and 3 handfuls less due to xenophone sampling, would rest in its dark, silent bulk. Another day's minute erosion performed, another day's continuity assured, in the endless quiet, monumental boredom of an empire that fed itself one perfectly recorded, perfectly uneventful day at a time. The change, when it came, was not marked by a single day, but by a gradual, almost imperceptible accumulation of slight alterations, like the slow settling of the very earth on which the granary stood. The fierce, white hammer of the late summer sun softened into a gentler, golden mallet. The angle of light piercing the high windows shifted, no longer striking the floor at noon with a vertical, oppressive intensity, but entering longer, more slanted beams that reached deeper into the granary and hash 39 recesses, illuminating for the first time in months the topmost amphorae on the eastern rack. The quality of the air transformed, molecule by molecule. The dry, baked dust scent of August gradually acquired underlying coolness. A hint of dampness carried from the Tiber estuary on mornings that now began with a faint, pearl-gray mist that clung to the rooftops until the 3rd hour. This shift from high summer to early autumn was registered in the Horia Galbai not through poetry or celebration, but through a series of minor administrative and sensory adjustments. Paulus Probus, consulting the master calendar pinned to his office wall, noted the approaching Ida Septembers and the consequent need to begin preparations for the arrival of the Egyptian grain fleet, the Navigium Isidis, which would bring the first massive shipments of the new harvest from the Nile Delta. This did not mean immediate action, but rather the initiation of preparatory paperwork, a formal request to the office of the Prefectus Ananae for additional Sakari, The muscular, guild-regulated sack carriers drafted on a scroll of particularly fine papyrus. An inventory of empty storage space across all 10 granary sheds. A task that would take Lucius the better part of 3 days, and a requisition order for extra mouse traps and rat poison, as fresh grain invariably brought fresh pests. For Secundus, the change was felt in the texture of his work. The morning chill, which lingered longer in the shaded interior of the shed, meant the dust was slightly less volatile, his sweeping raising less of a haze. The cooler, damper air also caused the old wood of the broom handle to feel different, firmer, less likely to splinter. He noticed a new pattern of condensation on the interior of the great oak doors each morning, a faint, dew-like dampness that he would wipe away with a dry rag before Aldous' arrival, a task not formally assigned, but which he had assumed as part of his custodial dominion. The ginger cat, whose presence had become a daily expectation, now sought its naps in the patches of sunlight that fell closer to midday, following the solar warmth with a precision that put the water clock to shame. No, for Lucius, the seasonal shift was heralded by a new set of figures to copy and memorize. Malvoyance, the projected tonnage of the Egyptian fleet, the estimated dates of arrival, broken down by the probable order of the ships docking based on prevailing winds, the few revised tax percentages on grain from the province of Africa, proconsularis following a reportedly bountiful harvest there. His afternoons were now filled with columns, numbers that represented not static holdings, but anticipated flows, a future of plenty to be logged, measured, and contained. The sheer volume of impending work cast a faint, professional anxiety over his routine, a sense of a looming, quantitative cliff. Yet the work itself remained the same. The scratch of the pen, the click of the abacus, the smooth feel of wax under his stylus. One morning, about a week after the first tangible hint of autumn had entered the air, a minor event of procedural interest occurred. As Secundus was performing his morning inspection of the mouse traps along the western wall, he found not a mouse, but a small, brown-field lizard, frozen and deceased in one of the snares. It was an unusual cat. The creature must have come in through a high window, seeking warmth or insects, and met its end in the mechanism designed for rodents. Secundus stared at it for a long moment, its delicate, scaly toes, its lidless eyes like tiny black beads. This was outside. Protocol. The report categories were for rodents, not reptiles. He carefully disengaged the stiff little body, carried it to his office nook, and presented it, laid on a piece of scrap linen, to Alice. Domine, he said, his voice even more subdued than usual. But not a mouse. Hello. Aldous looked up from a ledger, his eyes dropping to the lizard. He adjusted his own spectacles, simple glass lenses in a wire frame he used for close work, and peered at it. He did not touch it. Laterta agilis, he identified after a pause. A field lizard. Unusual. What he pondered the bureaucratic dilemma. Finally, he said, dispose of it in the report. Mark it as one catch, non-rodent. Add a note that traps along the western wall may need their bait checked for broader effectiveness. Nobody. Yes, Domine, Secundus said, relieved. He took the lizard outside and placed it in the mule, midden heap behind the sheds, where the gulls would find it. He then returned and made the notation on his wax tablet. Unum captum, non glares. animadverta escain, moveltote plagis occidentalis, postus occidentalis. It was perhaps the most interesting notation he had made in years, and it gave him a small, peculiar sense of having encountered the wild, unpredictable edge of the world, even if that edge was only 6 inches long and already dead. The following day, the sampling agent Xenophon returned, not for a routine check, but for a pre-shipment quality verification of the remaining stock of Alexandrian wheat from the previous year. The Empire could not afford to mix old, potentially spoiled grain with the new harvest. This was a more thorough, more solemn process. He took samples from 20 sacks, selected by a complex formula involving their position in the stack and the date stamps on their shipping manifests. The granary was silent, save for the shamadu, repetitive crunch twist of the sampling tool and the soft rustle of grain being poured onto the linen. This time, Xenophon not only tasted and weighed, but also performed a germination test, placing a dozen kernels on a damp sponge he produced from his kit, to be examined in 2 days and hash 39. Time for signs of sprouting, a test of the seed's vitality and, by extension, its freshness. The presence of the sponge, a damp, green anomaly in the dry world of the granary, felt almost shocking. Lucius watched, fascinated, as Xenophon carefully placed the seeded sponge in a small wooden box and sealed it with his guild seal. "You will guard this," Xenophon instructed Aulus. "Keep it at moderate temperature, not in direct sun, not in a damp cellar. I will return after the Nandi night to read the result." No, wait. For 3 days, the small sealed box sat on a shelf in Aulus' office, a silent, pregnant object. It was a capsule of potential life amidst the records of stored sustenance. It drew glances from all 3 men, a mute symbol of judgment. Aulus found himself adjusting his scrolls to keep them from lying too close to it, as if the box emitted a faint biological field that might compromise the purity of his paperwork. On the appointed day, Xenophon returned, opened the box with a small knife, and examined the sponge. 9 kernels showed a tiny white radical emergence. 3 did not. He nodded, more to himself than to anyone else. Acceptable germination rate. The stalk is cleared for blending with the new harvest, not to exceed a ratio of 1 part old to 5 parts new. He made a note on a tablet, had Lucius copy it, and apply the seal, and departed with his sponge and his verdict. The granary had passed another test. The old wheat was not vibrant, but it was sufficient. It was a metaphor that none of the men had the leisure or inclination to consider. The days continued to shorten. The evening ritual of closing the doors now often happened in a twilight tinged with purple and orange, the air carrying the smoky scent of the first autumn fires from the town. Lucius's brief, haunting glimpse of the soul fishmonger's daughter was not repeated, but the memory of it, like the taste of the Xenophon's germination test, lingered as a tang of something beyond the granaries. He found himself listening more intently to the sounds from the dock. The cries of hawk, the stevedores, the creak of ropes, not as mere background noise, but as the soundtrack to a world of movement and journey, a contrast to his world of stillness, and a inventory. One afternoon, a logistical ripple from the approaching fleet finally reached them. Malahid, junior undersecretary from the questor's office, a pimply youth barely older than Lucius but armored in the hauteur of minor officialdom, arrived with a scroll. He announced that sheds 7 and 8 had been designated as primary staging areas for the quality sorting of the incoming Egyptian grain. This meant that within the fortnight, a portion of their current orderly holdings would need to be temporarily relocated to Shed 10 to make space for the sorting tables and winnowing basket. This news generated a flurry of activity that, for the Horia Galbai, constituted high young Galbai. Drama, Totolio. Autos spent an entire day with the ground plans of the complex, calculating SAC displacement with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Lucius was tasked with creating a transfer manifest, a document that would track every single sack and amphora moved, lest something be lost in the temporary shuffle. A bureaucratic nightmare of epic proportions, the Secundus began the physical preparation, clearing the full designated areas near the doors, reinforcing the pallets in Shed 10, and checking the handguards for worn axles. For several days, the granary hummed with a different frequency. The silence was broken by the grunts of Zachary, borrowed from other sheds, the rumble of cartwheels on the stone floor, the shouted numbers as sacks were counted out and counted in. Yet, even this activity was governed by a crushing tedium. Each sack was identical. Each movement was logged. Dust, disturbed in earnest, filled the air in great cloud, making the shafts of sunlight into solid, swirling pillars of gold. Secundus, covered in a fine beige powder, swept incessantly, a Sisyphanian figure in a world of his own, making, finally, the space was cleared. A long empty stretch of floor lay bare, its stones older and darker where the sacks had rested for years, a perfect negative imprint of their presence. Sorting tables of plain pine were brought in and arranged with geometric precision. A series of large, shallow wicker winnowing baskets were stacked against a toe. The granary was now a machine ready to process the river of grain about to flow into it. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the flurry ceased. Borrowed Zachary left. The dust settled once more. The cleared space yawned, empty and expectant. But the fleet was not yet here. The weather in the Mediterranean was unpredictable. So they waited. The interim period was one of peculiar suspension. The usual routines continued. The sweeping, the trap checks, the ledger updates, but they were performed in a space that was physically and psychologically altered. The emptiness was a present. It whispered of the future, of a coming inundation of work. Aulus grew more taciturn, mentally rehearsing complex logistics. Lucius caught himself looking at the empty space, imagining it filled with a mountain of golden grain, feeling both anticipation and a dread of the endless counting to come. Secundus simply kept the cleared floor swept to an impossible standard of cleanliness, a blank slate awaiting its destiny. And then, one evening, as they sealed the doors on this half-empty, half-prepared shed, a new sound echoed across the harbor, clear and resonant in the cool autumn air. The long low blast of a bucina, a horn, not from the military fort, but from the lighthouse at the harbor mouth. It was followed by another and another. Signal horns. Lucius paused, his hand on the key. Aulus and Secundus stopped and listened. From the direction of the docks, a muffled cheer rose, then another. A distant, rhythmic chanting became audible, the pulling song of a shore crew. Aulus's face showed no emotion, but his eyes met Lucius's. The first trireme of the boat. Fleet, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Isis Feria, likely. It makes port. Head of the freighters. He turned and looked at the locked doors of the granary, as if he could see through the oak to the empty space within. "Tomorrow," he said, and it was not a word, but a sigh of resignation and purpose. "Tomorrow it begins." They walked home in a deepening twilight that felt charged, different. The air buzzed with a palpable energy from the port. Lucius felt his heart beat a little faster. Even Secundus walked with a slightly straighter posture, but for Olus, the feeling was one of immense weight settling onto his shoulders. The boring, beautiful equilibrium of storage was over. Now would come the frantic, meticulous, equally boring chaos of intake. The great cycle turned. The granary awaited its raison d'etre and hash 39 etter to be filled. The autumn had arrived not with a storm, but with the sound of a horn across water, heralding the beginning of a mountain of work so vast, so repetitive, so critical, that it would make the preceding months of quiet custody seem like a fleeting, peaceful dream. The story of the grain was entering a new chapter, one written not in the quiet script of preservation, but in the loud, dusty, numerical prose of superabundance. And they, its clerks and keepers, would inscribe every single monotonous word. The dawn that broke following the signal horns was not the gentle pearled affair of previous mornings. It arrived with a strident, brassy urgency, the sky paling to a hard, washed-out blue over a harbor that was no longer a placid basin, but a churning anthill of activity. The sounds that had been muffled rumors the night before were now the dominant reality. The distant shouts of pilots guiding ships into berths, the deep, percussive thuds of gangplanks hitting stone quays, the metallic shrieks of cargo cranes being tested, and beneath it all, a constant, low-grade roar that was the composite noise of 1,000 men and animals mobilizing. This sonic tide washed over the Horia Galbaya complex, seeping through the high windows of Shed 7 and filling the recently cleared space with a palpable sense of impending occupation. Aulus Probus arrived earlier than usual, his face set in lines of grim preparedness. He did not immediately unlock the granary doors. Instead, he stood before them without Secundus and Lucius, conducting a final briefing as if they were centurions before. Zigo, Otelven. The procedures are unchanged in essence, but magnified in scale, he began, his voice cutting through the harbor din with practiced clarity. The first loads will arrive after. The sun is fully up and the dew has burned off the sacks. Damp grain is to be rejected at the door. That is the responsibility of the foreman of the Sakari, but our eyes must confirm. And now, Lucius, your station will be at the sorting table nearest the door. You will tally each accepted load as it is poured for winnowing, using the new tally sticks. Your steward to a bucket of fresh notched wooden sticks by the door. 1 knot. Pamodios accepted. Secundus, your primary duty is flow. You will keep the area around the sorting tables clear of chaff and spillage. The winnowers will create great clouds of it. Sweep it immediately to the designated piles in the corners. It is to be collected later for fodder. You will also manage the water jugs for the sorting crews. Keep them full. A parched worker is a careless worker. Listen. He turned and inserted the key. The familiar clunk of the lock sounded strangely small against the backdrop of the bustling port. The doors swung open to reveal the empty, waiting space, the sorting tables like altars to a practical god. The morning light streamed in, illuminating not dust motes, but the void where the grain would soon be. For the first 2 hours, there was a strange, anticipatory lull within the shed. Even as the frenzy outside crescendoed, the condos swept the already clean floor again. And Lucius arranged his tally sticks, his inkpot, his wax tablet for notes, aligning them with all fastidious precision. Paulus walked the perimeter of the empty space, his footsteps echoing, mentally rehearsing each step. Then a new sound grew from the direction of the docks, a rhythmic grunting chant, deep and muscular. Have, oh, have, oh. It grew louder, accompanied by the shuffle of countless sandaled feet and the groaning of burdened wood. A column of men appeared at the open doors, silhouetted against the bright daylight. They were the Sakari, bare-chested and gleaming with sweat despite the morning. Cool, each man bearing a sack of grain across his shoulders that looked as large as he was. Their foreman, a bull-necked man with a whistle on a thong around his neck, stood at the head of the column. He exchanged a nod with Olus, then blew a sharp blast on his whistle. The column broke, and the first 2 carriers approached the nearest sorting table. With a synchronized, practiced twist, they upended their sack. A golden cataract of wheat erupted onto the table with a sound like a sudden, dry waterfall. The air in the shed was instantly transformed. It filled with a new, more potent version of the familiar grain. Smell, hot, fresh, carrying the faint, sun-baked scent of the Egyptian fields and the salty tongue of its sea voyage. A cloud of finer dust, the floor of the journey, poofed into the air, catching the light. The winnows, a team of 4 men who had entered quietly behind the carriers, stepped forward. They wore cloths tied over their noses and mouths. 2 took up large, flat winnowing baskets, scooped up great piles of the grain, and with a graceful rocking motion of their wrists and hips, tossed the grain into the air. The current from the open doors carried the lighter chaff and straw fragments away in a golden haze, settling in a slowly accumulating drift on the floor to Secundus' left. The heavier kernels fell back into the basket with a sound like rain. The other 2 men stood by, their eyes sharp, picking out any visible impurities, pebbles, large husks, the occasional errant bit of straw. With quick, darting hands, Lucius watched the first cascade, momentarily mesmerized by the sheer abundance. Then, his training reasserted itself. He picked up his first tally stick and a stylus. As the winner was declared a basket clean, its contents were poured into a fresh, empty sack, held open by a carrier. Lucius estimated the volume. Each basket held roughly 1 morius. He made a notch on his stick. 1, 2, 3. Another basket was cleaned, poured. Another notch. 7, 8, 9. The process was hypnotic in its rhythm. The dump, the scoop, the toss, the rain of grain, the pour, the knot. The chant of the carriers outside formed a bus line to the softer rustle and clatter within. Secundus sprang into action as the first pile of chaff grew. His broom was a constant, wishing presence, pushing the light debris into a neat, ever-expanding mound in the corner. He learned the rhythm of the winnower's tosses, sweeping in the pauses between throws to minimize the dust he himself raised. He also kept an eye on the young water jugs, refilling them from the large dolium by the door when they dipped halfway, the cool water splashing, sparkling in the morning light. Aulus stood like a captain on a deck, stationary near the center of the activity, his eyes missing nothing. He watched the winnower's hands for speed and thoroughness. He monitored Lucius tallying, occasionally stepping over to compare the notches on the fee, thick with the number of filled sacks accumulating by the far wall. He inspected samples of the cleaned grain, rubbing it between his fingers, checking for the hard, glossy finish that denoted quality. His presence was a silent governor on the process, ensuring that the frantic activity never tipped over into disorder. The morning wore on. The mountain of grain on the initial table was processed, replaced by another and another. The filled sacks, now bearing a chalk mark indicating they were cleaned Egyptian new stock, were stacked with methodical precision by another team at the rear of the shed, beginning to form a new, pristine wall of abundance. The soundscape inside Shed 7 became a symphony of industry. The grunt of dampers, the swish-toss of winnowing, the patter-rustle of falling grain, the scratch of Lucius's stylus, the constant swish-swish of Secundus' broom, and the dry whisper of accumulating chaff. By midday, a deep fatigue set in, but it was a fatigue of saturation, not of completion. The harbor 100 ships. Shed 7 had processed the grain from perhaps all and they broke for the noon meal, but the silence in the shed during that half hour was now filled with a ringing, phantom echo of the morning's noise. The men ate quickly, their ears still attuned to the ongoing din from the docks, knowing their respite was brief. The air they breathed was thick with a suspended haze of golden dust, which coated every surface, including their bread and cheese, giving the meal a subtle, gritty texture. The afternoon was a replication of the morning, a blur of golden motion and numerical accumulation. Lucius's hand began to cramp the tally stick. He switched hands, his world reduced to the rhythm of notch after notch. The numbers ceased to have meaning as quantities. They were simply beats in a song. Notch, notch, notch. Secundus' arms ached from the constant sweeping, but the motion was so ingrained it felt autonomic. The chaff mound in the corner grew into a small, soft hill, radiating a dry, hay-like warmth. As the sun began its decline, the light in the shed turned molten, gilding the swirling dust into a magical, blinding fog. The foreman of the Sakari blew his whistle twice, signaling the end of the day's shift for the carriers. The final sack was dumped, winnowed, poured, and tallied. An abrupt, staggering silence fell, broken only by the short, weary sighs of the winnowers as they stretched their backs, and the final, conclusive swish of Secundus's broom as he corralled the last of the day's chaff. Aulus, Lucius, and Secundus were left alone in a shed transformed. The cleared space was gone, replaced by a new fortress of full sacks, towering nearly as high as the old stores had. The air was opaque with dust, which slowly pirouetted in the sunset beams. The floor, despite Secundus' efforts, was gritty underfoot. Every surface wore a fine, blonde de faux. They were all coated in it. Lucius' dark hair was powdered gold. Secundus' eyebrows were pale with it. Aulus' grey tunic looked as if it had been woven from dust. Exhaustion was total, but there was no rest. The closing ritual was more elaborate. Sorting tables had to be brushed clean and pushed against the wall. The tally sticks had to be counted and reconciled. Lucius, with gritty, trembling fingers, added up his notches. He had used 3 full sticks and half of a fourth. Each stick held 100 notches. 357 modi of cleaned Egyptian wheat now stood in it. The new stack. He reported the figure to Aulus, who recorded it in the ledger with a hand that left a dusty print on the papyrus. Then they secured the shed. The doors were closed on a space that hummed with the day's expended energy, thick with the perfume of fresh harvest and human sweat. But although the lock's clunk was a profound relief, The walk home was silent, their bodies moving stiffly. The vibrant port energy now felt abrasive, an assault on their saturated senses. They parted with mere nods, word, beyond him. That night, Lucius dreamed, not of dolphin stamps or girls with baskets, but of endless, silent cascade of golden notches falling from a sky, the color of wheat, burying him. Secundus slept the sleep of the dead, his muscles twitching in phantom sweeping motions. Alice lay awake for a long time, listening to the distant, persistent sounds of the harbor, his mind already calculating the capacity of shed 8 for the next days. Intaka, the numbers scrolling behind his eyelids in a relentless, golden stream. The granary was no longer a place of quiet storage. It had become the beating heart of the Annona, a lung that inhaled the harvest of an empire in great, dusty gasps. And tomorrow, at dawn, it would inhale again. The boredom was not gone. It had merely been amplified, stretched over a frame of such colossal, repetitive effort that it achieved a kind of terrifying, majestic monotony. The story was no longer about the stillness of things kept, but about the torrent of things arriving, a flood to be measured, contained, and recorded, one identical golden grain at a time. The relentless intake of the Egyptian harvest settled over the ensuing days from a state of frantic emergency to a new, elevated plateau of normalcy. The initial shock of the deluge gave way to a grinding, daily acceptance of the torrent. Shed 7 and its neighboring sheds became perpetual motion machines, swallowing the labor of the docks and excreting neatly stacked mountains of verified, recorded grain. The dawn to a dusk rhythm of dumping, winnowing, sorting, tallying, and stacking became the world. Lucius' fingers grew callous from the tally sticks, his mind narrowing to a single, luminous point of focus. The notch. The number of notches per day became the sole measure of time's passage. 300. 400. On one prodigious day, 520. He dreamt in tallies, his sleeping mind constructing vast, numerical architectures that collapsed into showers of golden notches upon waking. The Secundus adapted to the permanent dust. It was no longer a layer to be removed, but the very medium in which he worked. Like a fish in water, his sweeping was no longer about achieving cleanliness, but about managing chaos, directing the endless fallout from the winnowing baskets into the corners, where it was compacted by a succession of assistants into dense, fibrous bales of chaff. His broom wore down, the twigs fraying and shortening, and he replaced it with a new one from the store without comment. Old one set aside to be used later for lighting fires. The muscles in his shoulders and the back, constantly engaged, hardened into a new efficient topography beneath his tunic. Paulus operated in a state of hypervigilant calm. He was the fixed pole around which the whirlwind turned. His ledger swelled with daily intake figures. He coordinated with the foreman of the Sakari and winnowers, his authority now extending beyond the static world of stored goods into the dynamic, sweaty realm of logistics. He developed a cough, a dry, rasping thing from the constant dust, but refused to let it slow him. He sipped Posca infused with honey and thyme, a remedy his wife Tertia insisted upon, and continued his orbits of the shed, his eyes missing nothing. A winnower growing sloppy, with fatigue was replaced. A suspicious darkening in a sack of grain prompted its entire batch to be set aside for reinspection. A wobbly leg on a sorting table was shimmed with a wedge of wood before it could fail. The autumn equinox passed, unmarked by any ceremony within the granary wall. But the only sign was the further shortening of the days. meaning the final hours of sorting were now conducted by the warm smoky light of oil lamps hung from the pillars, their flames dancing in the draughts from the door, and casting gigantic leaping shadows of toiling men against the mountainous stacks of sacks. Lo, the world outside the granary ceased to exist. The fishmonger's daughter, the slow progress of the snail, the spider's web, all were swallowed by the monolithic reality of the harvest. Then, imperceptibly at first, the pressure began to ease. The lines of Sakari at the doors grew shorter. Until the intervals between the arrival of loaded carts lengthened. Great ships in the harbour, their bellies emptied, began to depart for other ports or for winter berthing. One afternoon, the foreman of the carriers blew his whistle at the second hour past noon, and no new column of men appeared behind him. The last sack on the last sorting table was winnowed, poured and tallied. The winnowers sat down, their baskets, their work done. An unnatural, ringing silence descended, broken only by the final sweeping strokes of Secundus's broom, and the rustle as Lucius tallied his last stick of the day, of the week, of the intake season. They stood, the three of them, in a shed transformed for the second time, where there had been empty space, then organized stacks of old stock, then chaotic processing floors. There now stood a colossal, seemingly endless fortress of grain. It reached nearly to the high windows, the sacks stacked in interlocking patterns for stability, forming sheer cliffs of burlap that seemed to absorb the sound and the light. The air, though still, dusty, was still. The tools of processing, the baskets, the tables, stood unused against the walls, already looking like relics. The exhaustion they felt was different now. Not the acute fatigue of a day's struggle, but the deep, bone-level weariness of a campaign concluded. The following days were a period of decompression and reckoning. The physical labor diminished, but the bureaucratic burden reached its zenith. Now began the grand reconciliation. Every tally stick from every shed, hundreds of them, had to be collected. Lucius's world, once the simple rhythm of the notch, now became a labyrinth of totals and cross-references. He and clerks from the other sheds gathered in a central office, a room buzzing with the low murmur of numbers and the frantic clicking of a bassi. They compared the carriers' manifests from the ships, often optimistic, against the winnowers' rejection rates, scrupulously recorded, against the final, sacred tally of clean Modi now. Sitting in the granaries, discrepancies were inevitable. I'm missing 5 Modi here, a 10 Modi overage there. Each required investigation. Was it a counting error? A theft? A misgrading? Paulus was in his element, a detective of dry goods, tracing phantom grain through a paper trail of wax tablets and chalk marks. Pity. The was tedious, painstaking work that made the physical labor seem simple by comparison. Secundus, meanwhile, oversaw the great cleanse. With the help of a few other slaves, he attacked the accumulated filth of months. The chaff mountains were bagged and removed. Every surface was swept, and swept again, then wiped with damp cloths. The sorting tables were scrubbed clean of grain dust and dirt. The floor was mopped, for the first time in living memory, the water turning an opaque, milky brown. The granary was to be returned not just to order, but to a state of ceremonial purity, suitable for its resumed role as a temple of storage. The smell changed from the hot, spicy odor of air, fresh processing back to the cooler, drier, more solemn scent of grain at rest, though now magnified 100-fold. Aulus, at the climax of the reconciliation, discovered a persistent, nagging shortfall between the carrier manifests and the final tallies. Across all sheds, there was a deficit of 107 modi, not a huge percentage of the total intake, but significant. He pored over the records, his brow furrowed. Finally, he identified the likely cause: the dockage allowance, the expected loss from spillage, sampling, and moisture evaporation during the transfer from ship to cart to granary had been underestimated by the questor's office in their pre-harvest calculations. It was not theft, not error, but a slight miscalibration of nature's tax. He drafted a meticulous report, citing the figures, explaining the probable cause, and recommending an adjustment to the dockage rate for the following year's harvest. He sanded the document, rolled it, tied it, and sent it to Rome. It was his masterpiece of bureaucratic observation, a monument to the significance of the insignificant. He never received a reply, which he took as the highest form of commendation. Weeks had slipped by. The fierce heat of the intake had given way to the crisp, clear chill of genuine autumn. Wellness. One morning, Aulus arrived at the granary, unlocked the doors, and instead of the cacophony of industry, was met with the familiar, deep silence of all stocked abundance. The cleansing was complete. The reckoning was done. Secundus stood by his broom, not in a cloud of chaff, but on a floor that shone dully in the morning light. Lucio sat at his desk, not with tally sticks, but with a fresh sheet of papyrus, ready to begin the updated, monumental inventory of the granary complex total holding. Aulus took his place in his office. He looked out at the silent, soaring stack. Geometric ranks of amphorae now pushed to the sides to make room for the new wheat. He listened to the profound quiet, broken only by the distant cry of a gull and the soft scratch of Lucius's pen. He cleared his throat, the dust-induced cough finally subsiding. "Secundus," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast full space. "The standard morning inspection. Mulia inspect. Pay particular attention to the new stacks for settling. We must check for shifting." "Yes, Domine," Secundus said, and picked up his broom, not to fight a current of all debris, but to sweep a floor that was already clean, a ritual gesture of readiness. "Lucius," Aulus continued, "begin the consolidated inventory. Start with shed 7. Wheat, Egyptian new stock. Count the stacks, verify the sacks per stack. We will work methodically. There is no longer any hurry." "Yes, Domine," Lucius said, a strange feeling of spaciousness opening in his mind, where the relentless numbers of intake had been. He picked up his stylus. The task ahead was vast, counting hundreds of thousands of modi, but it was a static vastness, a sea to be mapped, not a river to be dammed. The granary had completed its great inhalation. Now began the long, slow, silent exhalation of winter and spring, as the grain would be meticulously doled out to feed the city. The frantic pulse of harvest had returned to the steady, metronomic beat of custodial heart. The dust had settled, literally and figuratively. The excitement was over. The profound, familiar, comforting boredom had returned, deepened and enriched by the trial it had endured. They were no longer just keepers of grain. They were survivors of its flood, veterans of abundance. And as Lucius began his count, stack 150 sacks, presumed 50 modi each, and Secundus swept a floor already free of dust, and Aulus reviewed a ledger of stunning completeness. They all felt, in their own ways, a sense of peace that bordered on the sublime. The crisis had passed. The empire was fed, and now there was nothing to do but count and sweep and watch until the cycle turned once more. The story returned to its favorite subject. Nothing happening on a grand, monumental, and beautifully boring scale. The peace that followed the harvest's assimilation was not the same as the peace that had preceded it. It was a deeper, more saturated quiet, weighted by the sheer physical presence of the new stock. The air in Granary Shed 7, though cleared of the storm of chaff, now held a denser, more profound stillness, pressed upon by thousands of sacks that reached towards the ceiling. The silence was no longer empty, but full. A cabinet carefully packed with linen, where before it had been bare shelves. The faint scuttling of a mouse, or the settling of a sack, now produced a muffled, absorbed sound, deadened by the immense buffer of stored calories. The work, too, regained its old rhythms, but with a new gravity. Lucius' consolidated inventory was a task of monumental patience. He did not count every sack. That would have been impossible. Instead, he employed the standard methodology. Count the number of sacks in a representative stack, measure the stack's dimensions, and then extrapolate across the entire shed. This required precise measurement with a more total, careful notation of stack variations. Some were pyramidal for stability, others rectangular, and complex calculations on the abacus. He moved through the forest of vines, grain like a surveyor, mapping an uncharted but meticulously planted territory. Each day yielded a new number. Shed 7, wheat, Egyptian, estimated 22,400 modi. This figure was then debated with Olus, who would point to areas where the sacks were less tightly packed, suggesting a reduction of perhaps 2%. Lucius would adjust 21,1952 modi. The number was fiction, but it was a fiction forged in the rigorous fires of Roman administrative practice, and therefore as good as fact. Secundus duties contracted back to their essential circular core. The morning trap, check, no, the sweeping of the floor, a floor that now only gathered a fine, almost respectful layer of dust that seeped eternally from the burlap. The inspection of the amphorae for seeping oil or cracks, a slower process now that they were crowded towards the walls by the grain. Only his world narrowed again to the granular. The feel of a single wheat kernel under his sandal, promptly picked up and returned to the nearest sack. The pattern of light on a specific patch of floor that he could now sweep with his eyes closed. The precise amount of water needed to dampen the rag for wiping the kaya. Water jug clean. The cat, which had deserted the shed during the noisy harvest, returned, finding its old spot now, in the shadow of a colossal stack. It resumed its wild, napping with a renewed intensity, as if making up for lost time. For Aulus, this period was one of administrative reflection and projection. With the intake tools finalized and the reconciled ledgers sent to Rome, his mind turned to the outflow, the fermentationus, the grain dole for the citizen populace of Rome, was a year-round operation, but its rhythm changed with the seasons. The arrival of the Egyptian grain meant reserves were flush, but it also triggered a complex schedule of distributions from Ostia up the Tiber to the capital. He received, via a clerk on a fast horse, the monthly allocation decree from the prefectus Anani. It was a scroll of an intimidating brevity, commanding the release of a staggering number of modi to the Guild of Bakers and the state warehouses in Rome. This single figure set in motion a week of subordinate calculations. How much from Shed 7 versus Shed 8? How to deplete stacks evenly to maintain structural stability the scheduling of barge traffic on the river to avoid bottlenecks. One morning, a tangible piece of this outflow process arrived in the form of two men, a mensor frumentarius, an official grain measurer, and his assistant. They were not like Xenophon the sampler. Their concern was not quality, but exact quantity. They brought with them the official modius measure, a bronze vessel stamped with the seal of Thea. The fiscus, its volume unvarying and legally defined. Their job was to oversee the transfer of grain from the storage sacks into the transport sacks, ensuring every modius dispensed was a true modius, heaped and then leveled off with a wooden trickle. Their presence introduced a new, ceremonial slowness to the granary. A section of a sack was designated for disbursement. Secundus and two other slaves carefully brought the sacks down and emptied them into a large temporary holding bin. The mensor stood beside it, his modius measure in hand. His assistant held a wax tablet for each scoop. The mensor would plunge the measure into the grain, fill it to overflowing, then sweep the trickle across the top with a firm, flat motion, sending a small cascade of kernels back into the bin. He would then pour the perfectly leveled measure into a fresh open transport sack. 1. The assistant would intone, making a mark. The process was hypnotic in its exactitude and its mind-numbing repetition. Plunge, fill, sweep, pour, plunger, fill, sweep, pour. The sound was a soft, rhythmic swish, crunch, tap, swish, as grain flowed from bin to measure to sack. Lucius was tasked with cross-tallying the assistant's count. He stood with his own tablet, making a mark for every fifth modius called out. His job was to ensure the two counts never diverged. For hours, the only sounds in the shed were the ritual sounds of measurement and the two voices alternating. Mark. OS 48. Mark. It was a different kind of tedium from the harvest tallying. It was slower, more deliberate, more solemn. Each modius was being legally witnessed into existence as a unit of state transfer. The dust raised was minimal, a fine, golden mist that hung in the shafts of light around the measuring station. Secundus, when not fetching sacks, watched the growing mound of grain in the holding bin. He observed how the kernels moved, how they found their angle of repose. He saw how the mensor's sweeping motion created a small, perfect plane on the top of the tie measure, a momentary flat world bold. He found it oddly satisfying. At the end of the first day, after 500 modii had been measured out and the officials had left, Secundus approached the bin. The process was not quite finished. A shallow layer of grain, perhaps 3 modii worth, remained in the bottom, too little for the mensor to bother with on his final scoop. It was spillage, officially accounted for in the margin. Secundus took a small brush and dustpan and collected this residue with extraordinary care, not losing a single kernel. He did not pour it into the transport sacks. That would be a lot of the measured count, nor back into the storage sacks, which were now empty. Instead, he took it to the small secondary barrel for animal feed and sweepings. It was the correct, prescribed destination. But for a moment he held the dustpan, feeling the slight weight of the grain, a weight that represented the irreducible, unmeasurable fragment left behind by even the most precise system. Then he tipped it in. The tiny cascade made no sound at all. The measured grain was sewn into its transport sacks. each sack now bearing a lead seal from the menser stamped with the figure of Ceres and the amount. These sacks were loaded onto carts, then onto barges, beginning their slow, placid journey up the Tiber Rome to be transformed into bread for the idol, voting masses of the metropolis. In Shed 7, a corresponding void appeared in the previously unbroken wall of sacks, a neat rectangular cave of empty space, revealing the darker, cooler brick of the back wall for the first time since the harvest. This space was not to be refilled. It was the first tangible evidence of the granary's purpose being fulfilled. It was a negative space that spoke of positive action. Rome was being fed. Days turned into weeks. The autumn rains began, a soft, persistent drizzle that pattered on the roof tiles and filled the water dolia to overflowing. The dampness in the air brought a new concern: mold. Paulus ordered a series of small clay pots of quicklime to be placed strategically in the sheds to absorb moisture. Their acrid, alkaline smell subtly infiltrated the grain dust aroma. Ada Secundus inspections now included running his hand along the bottom sacks of each stack, feeling for the telltale damp warmth of spoilage. He found none. The cycle of measurement and shipment repeated at regular intervals, each time carving out another neat chunk from the stored abundance. The granary was a living body, its mass slowly, methodically consumed, and with each contraction, the sense of space within the shed expanded fractionally. The echo of a footstep grew slightly louder. The cat had new, empty runnels to explore between stacks. The light from the window reached a little farther. One afternoon, as a pale, washed-out winter sun cast long, weak shadows, Lucius finished the final calculation of the updated inventory, accounting for the latest disposement. He presented the figure to Olus. Shed 7, net hold, following the tempo allocation. 18,105 modi estimated. Paulus looked at the number, then looked out at the granary. The towering, seamless fortress was now a landscape with canyons and cliffs, its topography altered by planned depletion. He nodded. Satisfactory, he said. It was high praise. That evening, as they locked the doors on the partially diminished but still awe-inspiring door, the winter chill bit sharper. Their breath fogged in the air before the heavy oak closed on the darkness within. The granary was doing its job. It was giving itself up, kernel by legally measured kernel, to the maw of the city. The excitement of intake, the drama of the flood, was a memory. Now was the time of the slow, predictable ebb, governed by measure and seal and ledger. It was, in its way, even more boring than storage, for it was storage in reverse, a meticulous unbuilding, and in that sacred, monotonous unraveling, in the swish crunch tap swish of the official modius, in the growth of negative space between the stacks, in the nightly clunk of the lock, securing a slightly lesser, but no less orderly, abundance, lay the profound, unsung victory of Roman order over chaos, of patience over time, of bureaucracy over hunger. The story continued, not with a roar, but with the soft, relentless whisper of grain flowing in its appointed, measured, and utterly predictable stream. Passage of time within the granary, marked only by the slow retreat of the grain. Stacks and the advancing chill of winter began to etch its subtle changes upon the men themselves. The relentless dust of the harvest season, though now settled, seemed to have left a permanent patina. In the slanting light of a late afternoon, one could see filaments of grey in Ola's hair that had not been there in the fervid days of autumn. His movements, always precise, had acquired a certain deliberateness, a conscious economy of motion that spoke not of fatigue, but of a body in quiet dialogue with its own endurance. The cough was gone, but he would sometimes pause, his hand resting on the cool clay of an amphora, and gaze at the mountainous stacks as if calculating not just their volume, but the weight of the seasons he had spent in their shadow. Secundus, too, showed the seasons passage. The calluses on his palms from the broom handle were now permanent features. Like leather pad, he moved through his tasks with an efficiency that was almost spectral, his presence so woven into the fabric of the place that he seemed to cause no disturbance, not even to the air. He had developed a silent rapport with a ginger cat, which now occasionally deigned to brush against his leg before its morning nap, a gesture Secundus acknowledged with the virus slowing of his sweeping rhythm. His world had contracted to a profound intimacy with the granary's details. He knew which floor tile had a hairline crack that caught the dust, which rafted beam creaked when the weather turned damp, the exact spot where the winter sun would fall at the third hour. A pale, weak coin of light on the floor, would sweep around until it vanished. Lucius felt the change not in his body, but in his perception. The frantic, numerical adrenaline of the harvest and the solemn tally of disbursements had matured into a deep understanding of the system. He no longer just copied figures. He anticipated them. He could glance at a stack and estimate its count within a few sacks. He could predict the menser's timing, the rhythm of the queries from the questor's office, the brief, vivid pang he felt upon seeing the fishmonger's daughter had softened into a general ambient awareness of a life outside, a life that proceeded in parallel to this one, of measured abundance. He began to think, in vague terms, of a future, perhaps a clerkship in Rome itself. In the vast central archives of the Annona, it was a thought that carried no excitement, only a different scale of quietude. He practiced his Greek in the evenings with renewed, methodical purpose. Winter solidified its hold. A week of cold rain was followed by a snap of dry, biting frost. Ice gleamed in the ruts of the cart tracks outside. Inside the granary, the air grew piercingly cold, a dry cold that seemed to emanate from the very grain. They took to wearing their thickest wool cloaks even indoors. Aulus authorized the sparing use of a single brazier for the office, its meager warmth, a luxury that made the ink flow more easily. The process of disbursement slowed. The Tiber barges were sometimes delayed by fog or ice. The interval between the visits of the menser grew longer. The granary entered a state of profound hibernation, a frozen reservoir of summer's energy. It was during this deep winter lull that a small personal rite of passage occurred. Aulus, reviewing a decade-old ledger for precedent on a frost-damage clause, called Lucius to his desk. He pointed a bony finger at a column of figures. This entry, from the 6th year of Hadrian's reign, the notation on spoilage during a wet spring. Do you see the flaw in the calculation? Always us. Lucius leaned over, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. He studied the figures, the style of handwriting older and more florid than Aulus. He saw it, a transposition error in the tens column, throwing the total off by 90 modi. The scribe wrote elix for 40, but calculated it as 90, Lucius said. Aulus nodded, a slow, grave motion. A costly error, though likely never discovered outside this ledger. The lesson is not the error, but the fact it lies here, undisturbed. 30 years. Well, our work is a wall against chaos. Most of the bricks will never be seen. But what do you Each must be laid true, for if one is loose, the wall may stand, but it is no longer true. He looked at Lucius, his eyes pale and clear in the grey light. You lay true bricks, Lucius. It was the closest thing to mentorship, to fatherly approval, Lucius had ever received. From him, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the brazier. Wow. Thank you, Domine. Aulus returned to his ledger. Do not thank me. Simply continue. The winter solstice passed, uncelebrated within the granary walls, though the slightly longer days that followed were perceptible in the gradually widening patch of noon sunlight on the floor. The rhythm of work began, almost imperceptibly, to quicken. The sun and the first shipments of the new year were scheduled. The Mensa returned, his nose red from the cold, and the ritual of the bronze measure began anew. Swish, crunch, tap, swish. The void in the grain stacks deepened and multiplied. One morning in early spring, with a timid sun finally holding some warmth, arrived. He was younger than Aulus, with the keen, slightly impatient air of a man on his way up the cursus honorum. He was an adjutor to the procurator Anani, come for a final pre-spring audit. Noted. He moved through the granary with Aulus at his side, tapping stacks, inspecting seals, glancing at ledgers with rapid, assessing eyes. He asked sharp, technical questions about moisture content and rodent mortality rate. Aulus answered each with unflappable, data-rich calm, referencing ledgers and tablets without hesitation. Unloaded, the young editor, finding no fault, no loose brick in the wall, departed with a look of grudging respect. His visit was a reminder that the system had eyes, that their quiet fidelity was part of a vast unseen network of accountability. After he left, Aulus stood for a long time in the center of the shed. He looked at the tolens. Stacks, now perhaps half their harvest height. He looked at Secundus, silently mending, now in sack in a pool of sunlight. He looked at Lucius, bent over his desk, updating the far audit figures. He felt the familiar, dry ache in his joints that the winter cold exacerbated. He thought of the coming summer and the next harvest flood. The cycle was eternal, but a man's participation in it was not. A few days later, he called Lucius into the office. I have drafted a recommendation to the procurator, Aulus said without preamble, his voice its usual dry rasp. It suggests that, given the increasing complexities of the Egyptian grain allocations and your competent handling of the reconciliation, you be considered for a junior administrative position in the Central Austrian Records Office next year. It is not Rome, but it is a step. The work is similar, but the view is different. Malbesoil? Lucius was stunned. Ayago. It was recognition of a concrete kind, a shuffling of the bricks into a new pattern. I am grateful, Domine. Do not be, Aulus said, but his tone was not unkind. It is a need of the service. You are a reliable instrument. The service has use for reliable instruments in various positions. Nay, he paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, I will of course require a replacement here. Training will be necessary. The message was clear. The end of one pattern was the beginning of another. Lucius felt a sudden, unexpected fondness for the dusty, golden gloom of Shed 7, for the sound of Secundus' broom, or the very smell of it. It would be a year, perhaps more, but an end was now in sight, a gentle, bureaucratic conclusion to this chapter of his life. Spring announced itself in earnest. The damp air lost its knife's edge. The first hardy insects buzzed at the high windows. The cat shed great tufts of ginger fur, and those grain, the ever-present grain, continued its slow, measured exodus. The stacks diminished further, revealing more and more of the granary's architecture, like a statue emerging from a block of stone. One afternoon, with the doors open to admit a gentle southerly breeze, Ola stood at the threshold. He watched a cart laden with sealed sacks rumble away towards the river Tortoli. He listened to the sounds of Ostia rejuvenating, the calls of merchants, the call, laughter of children, the distant slap of water against pilings. He thought of his recommendation for Lucius, of the inevitable day when he himself would hand over the ring of keys, of the quiet retirement with Tertia that awaited him in a small house on the outskirts of town. At the granary would go on. The wheat would flow in and flow out. Other ordained hands would sweep. Other styly would scratch figures on wax. He turned and looked back into the shed. Secundus was patching a mouse-chewed corner of a sack with a small piece of leather, his concentration absolute. Lucius was filing away the completed shipment manifest. The late sun poured in, thick and ornate, illuminating the countless dust motes dancing in the air above the remaining stacks, the same eternal dance. Nothing was finished. Everything continued, but for Aulus Probus, head clerk of granary, shed 7 of the Horia Galbae. The story, his story within this story, was beginning its slow, gentle, and perfectly natural descent towards a final, quiet punctuation. It was not an end of noise or drama, but the end of a long and eventful sentence, spoken in a whisper that had, in its way, helped to hold the world together. He took a deep breath of the grain-scented air, turned, and walked back, inside to his desk, to the ledger, to the numbers that waited, as they always would, for his careful boring and essential hand. The end, when it came for Aulus Probus, was as undramatic and procedural as the rest of his tenure. Well, there was no fanfare, no formal ceremony. On his final day, a Thursday in late spring, he completed the weekly report as usual, his handwriting steady and exact. He sanded the papyrus, rolled it, tied it with its linen string, and placed it in the 4 Questos review basket. He then took the heavy ring of keys from his belt, key to the great doors, the smaller bronze key for the strong box of seals, the worn steel key for his desk, and laid them on the clean surface of the wood. He removed his personal wax tablets, his own stylus, and a small wooden cup that held his personal supply of ink from the desk, placing them in a leather satchel. Secundus and Lucius stood before him. They had known this day was approaching, yet its arrival felt both monumental and insignificant, like the final sack removed from a stack, leaving the structure unchanged in essence. Secundus, Aulus said, his voice the same dry, measured instrument it had always been. You have been a fixed point. The new clerk, Drusus, will arrive tomorrow. You will show him the routines, the sundial fissure for the trap inspection, the proper method for reinforcing a sack seam. He will rely on you. Secundus bowed his head, a deeper nod than his usual acknowledgement. Yes, Domine. There was a weight to the word, a finality. He would stay. The granary was his world, and its rhythms would continue through him, uninterrupted. Aulus turned to Lucius. Your reassignment to the Central Records Office is confirmed. You begin after the Nundinae. Remember, the principles are the same. Accuracy, method, lead, patience, the scale is merely larger. Altered. I will remember, Lucius said. He felt a surprising tightness in his throat. This dusty, quiet shed had been the entirety of his professional life. Paulus had been its unshakable pillar, don't host. Paulus gave one last slow look around granary shed. 7. His eyes travelled over the soil. Amphorae, now fully visible again, as the grain stalks had receded to their normal, pre-harvest level. They moved over the stacks of wheat, still formidable, but orderly and auto. Known to the they took in the clean-swept floor. The empty sorting tables pushed against the wall, the water jug on its stand, the patch of sunlight on the third tile from the north wall, where the cat currently slept. He absorbed the quality of the silence, a silence he had curated for over 2 decades. He smelled the air, grain, dust, old wood, a hint of cool clay from the dolia. He nodded, once to himself. Then he picked up his satchel, turned, and walked out of the granary, leaving the keys on the desk. He did not look back. His footsteps echoed briefly in the corridor, and then were gone. Secundus and Lucius were left in the silence. It was the same silence, and yet it was different. Already, an axis had been removed, and the world had quietly, perfectly recalibrated itself around the absence. After a moment, Secundus walked to the broom, picked it up, and began to sweep a patch of floor that was already clean. The soft swish, swish was the sound of continuity. Lucius walked to Aulus' now empty desk. He looked at the ring of keys. Tomorrow, Drusus would pick them up. Tomorrow, new ledgers would be opened, new tallies begun. The granary would receive the first trickle of the African harvest soon. The cycle was perpetual. He returned to his own desk, gathered his things, and prepared to leave for the last time. As he reached the great doors, he paused. He looked back. Secundus was still, sweeping, a figure of eternal patient motion in the golden, dusty light. Their chest stretched, its claws scraping softly on the stone. A mote of dust caught a sunbeam, and spiraled upwards, beginning its endless, aimless dance anew. Lucius stepped out into the spring afternoon, pulling the heavy door closed behind him. He did not have the key to lock it. That was for Drusus now. From inside, as the door shut, he heard the final faint swish of Secundus's broom, and that was all. The story of Granary Shed 7 did not end. Aulus Probus walked home to his wife, to a retirement of quiet days. Lucius moved on to a larger office, with a view of the forum. Secundus remained, the eternal keeper of the dust and the silence. The granary stood, the wheat rested within it. The mice were born, tempted by traps, and died. The spider spun, waited, and consumed its web. The sun traveled its arc, the shafts of light pivoting slowly across the floor, marking the passage of hours, days, seasons, and years. The keys were passed from hand to steady hand. The ledgers were filled, archived, and replaced. The grain flowed in and flowed out, a slow, silent pulse that fed the heart of an empire. Nothing of note had ever really happened there, and nothing of note ever would. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system of mundane necessity, a masterpiece of boredom that held chaos at bay by the sheer, weighty, beautiful force of its routine. The doors opened and closed, and opened again. The broom swept, the pen scratched, the dust danced, and the world, unconcerned and unheeding, turned, nourished by the profound, unending, and utterly forgettable peace of a place where everything was always exactly as it was supposed to be. And so we leave them there, in that eternal golden dusk of routine. The granary doors are shut. The world outside fades to a soft murmur, and within, the great silent work of stillness continues. Let this image of order so profound it becomes peaceful, of purpose so simple it becomes sacred, settle over your own mind now. Let the rhythmic swish of the broom, the slow dance of the dust, the patient, untroubled weight of all those stored days lull your thoughts into a similar state of quiet alignment. Nothing is required. Nothing is pending. The grain is accounted for. The ledger is balanced. The watch is kept. You can rest now, as securely as those ancient stores, knowing that for a little while there is nothing to be done but breathe and be in the deep, comforting quiet that follows a story where everything and nothing happen. Let your thoughts drift like those final motes of dust, settling gently into the soft, welcoming dark. The tale is told. The night is here. All is well. Was it way? Sleep on.